Scientists and experts maintain that everything is bound to have an explanation, even the deepest, darkest mysteries. But this rule is seemingly not applicable to the phenomenon of vanishing into thin air, where no clue can be found to hint at a plausible solution. One such exception to the rule was the story of Mabel Crumbag, whose name still haunts the streets of Canada and poses the biggest question of all: how? The year was 1950, a time when Mabel was just 19 years old. One out of 3 children born to Sheldon and Helen. The family was like any other and lived a quaint life at 661 Willard Avenue in Toronto, Canada. One day, the couple were invited to a wedding in Detroit and departed that Saturday on the 27th of May, leaving Mabel in charge of her youngest brother, Gary. While babysitting, she would also make the most of her weekend by spending time with her boyfriend, James Bryan. The parents planned to return home that Sunday and were also making the most of their time away. James arrived at the Willard Avenue home at 11:30 that morning, and the pair would enjoy some table tennis and radio listening. At 12:30 that evening, James left the house and promised to return the following day for a Sunday dinner. But when he arrived back at the house the next day, something was amiss. The young man wasn't prepared for what he was about to find. He arrived at the front door and knocked, but there was no answer. All the doors were closed, but he soon realized they weren't locked. Immediately concerned, James stepped inside and found a note written by Gary. The note was addressed to Mabel, stating that when he got up that morning, he couldn't find her and decided to prepare breakfast for himself. He attached the note to the fridge and informed Mabel that he was heading out to play. James searched for Gary and eventually found him. When asked about his sister's whereabouts, the young boy said that he was wondering the same thing. Immediate concern washed over the man, who realized that his girlfriend was missing. The two began searching the house and the yard. Noticing the panic, a neighbor stopped to ask what was going on, and James explained the harrowing revelation. They asked another neighbor if they'd seen anything, but when all these efforts proved futile in locating the missing woman, they'd find themselves making that haunting call. The call was to the local police department, who took quick action. 400 residents were involved in a tireless search. They walked the neighborhood equipped with walkie-talkies, maps, and canines, and even a small plane. There was little in the way of clues, aside from a neatly made-up bed with a pair of pajama bottoms neatly folded under her pillow. The pajama top was missing, and Mabel's slippers were in the kitchen. They were strange details, ones that wouldn't lead anywhere. Sheldon and Helen returned that same day, only for their 2-day vacation in good spirits to be shattered by the shock of a missing daughter. Once they heard all of the odd details, they knew something was wrong. Mabel was diligent and wouldn't have left the doors unlocked, but both the main door and the side entrance were open. No signs of a struggle, no indication of foul play, and no clues left behind a disturbing mystery. With James having left the evening prior and most neighbors being asleep, police were left with only one witness. Gary recalled hearing the dog barking and possibly even a dog fight in the early morning hours. There was thumping and human voices. Predominantly, he heard a male voice and a high-pitched laugh coming from his sister. The laughter soon traveled off, and the young boy drifted back to sleep, but the strangeness wouldn't end there. Neighbors would add to the mystery, claiming that they heard a disembodied scream at around 2 a.m., the same time that Gary heard the voices and the barking dog. A couple had even walked past the home and saw the kitchen light on. Still, Mabel was nowhere to be seen. Her parents believed she would have never run away, and she certainly wouldn't have left her brother behind. They began to suspect theories of amnesia or possible abduction. As word of this disappearance made its way into the public eye, sightings began to take on a life of their own. A large portion of these alleged sightings were found to be false. Heartless prank phone calls were also prominent in this case. Despite receiving tips and exhaustive search efforts, no one could figure out what happened to Mabel. They knew she was missing, but how was the question. Case of Patricia Leventhal, a Louisiana-raised woman who enigmatically disappeared. Patricia attended A.E. Phillips School and later the Louisiana Tech University. While living in her hometown, she worked as a registered nurse. In 1990, after getting a divorce and marrying a doctor, Larry, she moved with her 2 children and new husband to Naples, Florida. While there, she would volunteer as the school nurse at the school that her children attended. Things were going well for the family. They were settling into their new home, new school, and new jobs. A year later, though, just as things were beginning to feel cozy, something would happen that sent unrest throughout the Florida community. On the 21st of August, 1991, Patricia and her husband were having a relaxing time in the jacuzzi, after having just attended the church choir practice. According to Larry, Patricia randomly decided to get out of the hot tub and go get some soda. Reportedly, she would climb into her blue 4-door 1991 Volvo and drive away from the house at around 11:30 p.m., and that would be the last time that anyone would see her. Patricia never returned home and was soon reported missing. In the days to come, her Volvo would be discovered abandoned in an apartment complex parking area. After linking the suspicious car to a missing person, investigators began dusting for prints, but strangely came up empty-handed. There were no clues, evidence, or traces that would lead to the missing woman's whereabouts. She'd seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. A newspaper reporting on the disappearance claimed that the 32-year-old had actually disappeared that night after an argument with Larry, an allegation that hasn't been confirmed. As the inquiries into Patricia's disappearance continued, police found that her bank accounts and credit cards were inactive. It's thought that she could have headed back to Louisiana, where her registered nurse license was active, though this theory meant that she would leave her children behind, which was certainly uncharacteristic. Law enforcement had very little to go on. No one had seen her, there were no fingerprints in the car, and no clues anywhere. So the case went cold. Patricia left a disturbing question in her wake. What happened that night? Cindy Weber had a rough start to life. She would endure some traumatic events in the lead-up to adulthood. Born to Arnott and Edna in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, Cindy was one of 3 children. She had 2 brothers named Kenneth and Ronald. Tragedy would strike in 1972 when she was just 13 years old. It was the unexpected and unfortunate passing of her father, but the grief wouldn't end there. Just as things were beginning to settle down, Kenneth would pass away too. The family found themselves struggling with the grief of losing their immediate relatives. Life was empty without them. Things only got worse when the next brother followed in their footsteps, passing away in 1976. By the time she was a teenager, Cindy had lost more than half of her family. The only 2 left were her and her mother. It's no doubt that these traumatic events contributed to the next phase of the woman's life. During her teenage years, she struggled with addiction. She was close to her father and siblings, and losing all of them almost simultaneously was too much. During this grieving period, Cindy would develop a history of running away and would be hospitalized several times. As if things couldn't get any worse, in 1979, at the age of 20, she sustained some serious injuries due to an incident. Brain and neurological trauma left her visually impaired, leading to the need for glasses. This wasn't the only result of an injurious incident. Cindy would have another life-altering effect. She couldn't walk without assistance and required various kinds of medications to control her violent shaking. Canes were used as a walking aid, but she couldn't get very far with them, so she often used a wheelchair. The worst part of all, Cindy lost the ability to speak. It was devastating. Following a horrific injury, she would find herself a permanent resident at the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital. On the weekends, she would go home to visit her mother and was said to hate staying at the hospital. It was at this facility, though, that she was receiving the necessary care and speech rehabilitation. But things only got worse. The facility contacted her mother and told her they'd be discontinuing Cindy's speech therapy, since she hadn't shown any improvement in the time she'd been there. They felt that her physical and neurological issues would never improve. Upset by this sudden undertaking, she tried to run out of her wheelchair and pleaded not to be returned to the hospital. Her wishes, of course, weren't withheld, and her next visit back home would add yet another layer of an already troubling life. It was the 18th of June, 1981, when Cindy headed to her home, located at 13511 118th Street, where Edna was waiting for her. It was a good day. Despite being wheelchair-bound, the now 22-year-old enjoyed the sunshine. The two would head to a movie and return home later that evening. Cindy headed to bed at around 10:30 that night. Her mother said goodnight and headed off to bed too. The following morning, though, Edna would find something truly confounding. It was 6:45 in the morning when she went into her daughter's room, only to find something impossible. Cindy was gone. She searched the house and found no sign of a struggle or disturbance. The wheelchair and medication that her daughter was dependent on were left behind. Cindy was nowhere to be seen. Edna checked the surrounding area, theorizing that her daughter could have dragged herself out of the house. The only thing out of place was the back door standing ajar, even though it was locked that evening. With no luck in locating Cindy, she phoned the Edmonton police, who prompted an exhaustive search effort. 4 dogs sniffed around the house several times, but there was no luck. If she'd managed to get out of the house, she couldn't have gone far without assistance, and even with assistance, she'd often lose her balance. But despite this, the search for Cindy, or any clues to her whereabouts, was fruitless. To this day, no trace of Cindy has ever been found. The same year that Kenneth Plaisted was brought into this world, in 1923, his mother Alice passed away, leaving Michael to raise their son alone in Duluth, Minnesota. Despite the tragedy, Kenneth seemingly had a good childhood, and when he was of age, he joined the Navy and served in the Second World War. By December of 1945, he would marry Priscilla Precourt, and they'd go on to have 6 children. In 1953, he graduated from law school and began his journey as the Attorney General of Wisconsin. After resigning from his position in 1956, he took up a job as the executive secretary of the National Board of Fur Farm Organizations, located in Milwaukee. The large Plaisted family would then move to Wauwatosa that year, and then to New Holstein some years later. New Holstein, located in Wisconsin, was a small town of just 3,000 people. There, Kenneth would join another law firm, becoming a partner to William Mullern and Thomas Lucas. Following the passing of Mullern, the practice had moved to Appleton, Wisconsin, and finally, Kenneth decided to go solo and move his practice again back to New Holstein. It would seem that this would be the firm's final setting, and by 1971 it was well established. On the 16th of November that year, the now 48-year-old Kenneth and his wife would drive 70 miles to Milwaukee on a business trip. The plan for the day would be to go to the hardware store, have a business meeting, and then take their 22-year-old daughter Donna to purchase a car. That morning, the businessman withdrew $350 from his wife's account. Priscilla and her husband arrived in Milwaukee around 11 a.m., and she was dropped off at the Gimbel's department store. Priscilla watched her husband drive off, not knowing this would be the last time that she would see him. Kenneth had driven just across the street to the Plankinton building to attend a business meeting, which he did show up for. He was due to pick his wife up at 12:30 or 1 p.m. that afternoon, but that time came and went. Priscilla waited until after 2 p.m. before phoning Donna. She claimed to have last heard from her father at around 11:15 that morning. When Donna went outside to look for Kenneth, assuming that he could arrive at any moment, she spotted his car down the street. As he approached, though, she discovered that it was her father's car, but he wasn't in it. The windows were rolled down, and the glove compartment was open and appeared to have been rummaged through. After looking around, she found another troubling clue, a hat in the gutter. It was an alarming sight, one that prompted the family to make contact with the police to report the man missing. It was a major case, one that saw the direct involvement of 20 policemen. They'd been tasked with searching bus stops, train stations, and airports. They came up empty-handed. Some supposed sightings flooded in, but after further investigation, it appeared that the witness had mistaken a similar-looking man, Gordon Russell, for Kenneth Plaisted. No credible sightings were reported after that. He'd simply disappeared without a trace. Then, a shocking coincidence would reveal itself. Kenneth, being the only practicing attorney in New Holstein, had been appointed as the attorney of the Howie brothers, Greg and Dennis. These 2 men were accused of burglary and were convicted and sentenced when they were found guilty. On the morning of the 16th, though, Greg had escaped from jail. He was only recaptured 2 years later. Police could find no evidence that linked him to Kenneth's disappearance, but noted that it was an unusual coincidence. Despite inquiries, searches, posters, and investigations, the prominent attorney remained missing. It was the 11th of March, 1994, when Charlotte Paulus began to feel unwell. She had plans to go out that Saturday evening in celebration of her brother's birthday. She called him to reschedule, informing Allie that she wasn't feeling too great. Throughout the day, Charlotte's condition would worsen, and eventually she began to suffer from dizzy spells. Her husband Paul decided enough was enough, and he decided to take his wife to the ER. He called his parents, asking if they could watch the couple's 2 children during the hospital visit. Charlotte would discover that her ailment wasn't anything major. It was a simple ear infection. She was given medication and a prescription that needed to be filled. When she arrived back at home that evening, she called her mother. The two chatted for some time and ended their conversation after 1:30 that morning. Little did she know that this was the last time she would speak to her daughter. The following morning at 8:30, Charlotte's mother called her to check in, but Paul answered the phone. He claimed that she was still asleep and that he would remind his wife to call her back, but that phone call never came. She tried calling the house several times, but there was no answer, which indicated that Paul wasn't home either, and possibly Charlotte was still asleep. When an aunt headed to the house later that day, she would discover that her niece was not asleep, recovering from an ear infection, but was missing. Later that evening, Charlotte's family was called by Paul, who was deeply concerned for his wife, who was nowhere to be found. He claimed that he woke up and Charlotte was still in bed. He spoke with her mother and then roused his wife to speak to her. He then told her to go back to sleep and that he'd be running some errands, taking the children with him. He left the house at 11 that morning and arrived home by 4 that afternoon. When Paul got inside, he realized his wife was gone, but her medication and purse were still there. Concerned, the family headed over to the Paulus home, and Paul's parents were already there. In fact, they'd been there the whole evening, according to neighbors who'd seen their car parked in the driveway throughout the night. More bizarre details would become apparent to the family, including that the house had been thoroughly cleaned, a factor that concerned them. According to them, Paul's father, the deputy coroner of Trumbull County, was allegedly instructing his son what to say and what not to say. Then they noticed a little shed on the property, which was surrounded by snow at this point. 2 sets of footprints seemed to lead the way to the shed's 2 bulging doors. When asked for the key, Paul strongly declined. Such strange behavior would continue for the course of the next few days, eventually leading to the point where the husband of the missing was asked to take a polygraph test. Mysteriously, Paul disappeared for months before returning and being charged with obstruction. During the 3 months that he was silent, the police were in the Paulus home, spraying luminol in search of vital fluid. Nothing was found in the house, and only a minor spot was found in the couple's vehicle. After initial tests, it was found not to belong to an animal, meaning it was possibly human. But before further investigation, the sample was mistakenly destroyed. But that wasn't the only thing that was destroyed. In 1999, 5 years after the disappearance, which was still unsolved, Charlotte's brother received a call from an anonymous person. They told him to check the dumpster by the Trumbull County Police Department. He did just that and discovered his sister's entire police file had been thrown in the trash. After taking this discovery further, he was told it was accidentally thrown out by the janitor in the building. Despite the evidence, bizarre behavior, and suspicious accidents, the case of Charlotte Paulus went eerily cold. Marion Perry, affectionately known as Cowboy to friends, was given the unfortunate diagnosis of depression in the early 80s. Although it's unclear if he was being treated for this, he was on cardiac medication. As far as most could tell, life was going smoothly for Marion following this diagnosis. That was until 1985 when he abruptly stopped taking his medication, although it hasn't been specified specifically what medication this was. But that year, the 58-year-old would mysteriously vanish, only to be found later disoriented in the woods. After getting him back on track with his medications, the Texas residence returned to normal, and he remained as such for another 10 years until panic swept across the town once more. It was the 23rd of February, 1995, when Marion was staying at a friend's house in Fannin County in Texas. He had plans to fish on the Red River during his stay. But that evening, the now 68-year-old began rubbing his chest, complaining of pains and discomfort. This wasn't necessarily out of the ordinary, since Marion was on cardiac medication, But nonetheless, he asked his friend if he could drive him to the VA hospital in Bonham, but he wasn't able to, and asked if it could wait until the morning. But it couldn't. Marion's condition slowly worsened, and he made the decision to drive himself there. He slipped into his car and left the house alone. That would be the last time anyone would see Marion Perry. When family and friends began to realize that he was gone, they reported him missing to the police, and an investigation quickly followed. First, the police headed to the hospital that Marion said he would be driving to, but there was no record of him there. 10 days later, his 1979 Ford Ranchero was found on the shoulder of the road on Highway 70, 7 miles from Bennington, Oklahoma. The vehicle had reportedly been abandoned there for days, and the man's personal belongings were all left behind. This included the black cowboy hat that earned him his nickname. Marion was known to make frequent trips to the hospital, given his condition, and is said to have had ties with the direct Texas area. Despite investigations into those leads, detectives could find no trace of the missing man. It's possible that on the night that he vanished, Marion may have been suffering from a heart attack, but the circumstances of his disappearance remain unclear. He has been classified as endangered and missing, and his case remains active. Pam Page, born Pamela Frisbee, was raised in Arkansas and found herself winning the lottery. She had a large and loving family. She was just one of 8 children born to Willie and Mary, who did the best job of raising them. Pam would go on to meet Rob Page when he was on leave from the Navy. Interestingly, Rob's sister was married to Pam's brother. The couple got engaged, and by 1977 they were married. The two found themselves moving from place to place due to Rob's Navy duties, and eventually they settled in Peoria, Arizona in 1983. Although the marriage started out well, things took a rough turn, and Pam had a pregnancy scare, and the two began talking about separating, and she began considering moving back to Arkansas. Then, when it was found that she actually wasn't pregnant, the two patched things up and were more in love than ever before. Pam and Rob were running a successful video rental store called Fast Forward Video, located in Glendale. By '89, the pair had been married for 12 years and things were going smoothly until they weren't. In July of that year, the 32-year-old headed to Arkansas to visit family for the week. The family recalls Pam being in good spirits upon her arrival. She spoke of her future plans and how in love she was with Rob. They were even looking at buying a house together, complete with brand new furniture, and were considering opening a second video rental store. Aside from the back pain and a sore stomach, the visit went well. The family was pleased to see her in such good spirits and with her whole future in order. That future, though, would be abruptly cut short. As Pam left her family home, no one knew that this would be the last time they saw her. The following Wednesday, 10 days after she arrived back in Arizona, one of the siblings tried to phone her, but forgot about the time difference. Much to her surprise, though, Rob answered the phone. He would tell the sister that Pam left him just 4 days earlier. Pam allegedly left a goodbye letter behind. Strangely, one of their Dachshunds, Rerun, was missing too, but the other dog had been left behind. The rest of the Frisbee family were frantically informed of the disappearance, and one by one they called Rob, asking him to read the letter that was left behind. Pam's father asked for a copy of it, which Rob happily sent through. The letter had been written via a typewriter, but was hand-signed by Pam at the bottom. But the family didn't believe that this was her signature. The letter told the story of a planned divorce and how she couldn't face it, and played 20 questions through the whole divorce process. She instructed her beloved husband to take care of the other dog, and told him that he should eat right and shouldn't live off of cereal and pizza, and Pam was gone. The Frisbees headed to Arizona to determine a timeline, but all they could find was that she was last seen that Friday evening. The family also found a mention of a Sarah in the letter unusual, and they never figured out who this Sarah was. Even after interviewing coworkers, they had no clues. Suspicions immediately fell on the heartbroken husband, but no evidence could tie him to any sort of crime. As police began to enter the case, they too named him as a suspect. The details that lead up to Pam's disappearance are no doubt suspicious, but a lack of evidence kept the case cold. It seemed that she had bizarrely vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. Not much is known about the background of Steven Frederick McGray. By 2020, the 63-year-old was a dementia sufferer with other medical concerns. He often frequented the areas between Princeville and Oak City, and was regularly seen walking one of his dogs. Steve, as he was mostly known, maintained a residence just outside of Tarboro, North Carolina. It would be from this very home that mystery would eerily present itself. It was the 3rd of January in 2020 when a friend arrived at the 700 block of Robertson School Road, Steven's home. He was there to help him pay some bills, but Steve decided that he didn't want to leave the house, so the friend left. Later that day, around 4 p.m., he spoke with his mother on the phone and claimed to have been having some medical issues. The conversation ended, and that would be the last time anyone would hear from him. 4 days drifted by, and the family grew increasingly concerned, so his son reported him missing. A silver alert was issued by the police, given Steve's medical condition. They also headed to the home, where they found a peculiar scene. The missing man's wallet and phone were both on the floor, but his debit card was missing, along with several other undisclosed items. The Edgecombe County Sheriff's Office, realizing this wasn't an ordinary disappearance, conducted a full-scale search operation within a 10-mile radius. ATVs, canines, and a helicopter were among these efforts, but they came up empty-handed. Just a month after his disappearance, one of Steve's daughters, Brittany McGray, was arrested. She was charged with 4 felonies, all of which were in connection with using her missing father's debit cards. According to the warrant, Brittany was being charged with identity theft, since she unknowingly obtained, possessed, and made use of identifying information. In addition, she entered her father's PIN number into an ATM and withdrew $500 from his card. These charges, though, would be dropped the following year, given that the victim was missing. Most bizarrely, the silver alert on Steve was also canceled, and his file was shelved, where it now lays collecting dust. What happened to Kathleen Behringer? This is the question that's been on the minds of Wyoming residents since 1989. It was that year that she and her teenage daughter were living on 1st Street, just across from Ash Grove Elementary School. Kathleen was 41 years old at the time, had been taking classes at Central Wyoming College, and had a part-time job at the Hilltop Bar. It was the morning of the 17th of April when young Kelly waved goodbye to her mother, who was wearing a bathrobe and carrying her purse and glasses. Little did she know this was the last time she would see Kathleen. That afternoon, Kelly arrived to an empty house, and concern immediately washed over her. Whenever her mother would go somewhere and wasn't expected back for some time, she left a note, yet no such note was present in the house. After further investigation, Kelly found that a recently cleaned ashtray that sat on the coffee table now contained 2 cigarette butts. One of them was her mother's brand, and the other belonged to a man named Donald Kenneth Pack Jr., a friend of Kathleen's ex. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Pack had been making frequent visits to the home. The two had been spending more time together, and he was even looking at purchasing a computer for her. Kelly recalled finding Pack creepy and didn't take well to him. That afternoon, he would show up at the house looking for Kathleen, but when he found that she wasn't there, he quickly dialed a number on the house phone. It seemed there was no answer, and without leaving a message, Pack left. Kelly headed to a friend's house and left a note behind for her mother in case she returned. But when she arrived later that evening, the letter was still untouched, and there was still no sign of her mother, aside from her vehicle being left behind in the driveway. Worried, she phoned her grandmother and told her that Kathleen had disappeared, and so the search began. When authorities arrived at the home and started their investigation, they theorized that she'd left with someone she knew, since there was no sign of a struggle. When they discovered who Kathleen was acquainted with, they grew even more concerned. Pack was on parole since October of 1984. He'd already served a 12-year sentence for aggravated assault and kidnapping. In fact, it was suggested that he was a suspect in more than 30 assault cases in Jackson, Wyoming. A psychologist even described him as intelligent and very dangerous, and while profiling the potential suspect, they discovered that his victims had shared several similarities that Kathleen also had. It remains unclear if Pack was ever questioned by authorities, and while he admitted to 2 allegations of assault, he maintained his innocence when it came to the case of Kathleen. He was never officially named a suspect, but was listed as a person of interest. Despite the history, this information would lead nowhere. No clues ever surfaced, and no body was ever found. Kathleen Behringer had vanished. Authorities continue to investigate the case, but as of 2025, there have been no significant breakthroughs. Justin William Hooiman was a star soccer player during high school, during which he suffered a severe leg injury, and he was prescribed OxyContin for the pain. Following a shoulder injury, Justin had to undergo surgery, which would lead to more medication. That medication resulted in an opioid addiction. Nonetheless, the Salt Lake City resident studied at the University of Utah and seemingly had a smooth run. But with the growing addiction, the young man would find himself spending a few months in prison in 2016 and was released on parole in 2017. By November of that year, he found himself living at a Fortitude Treatment Center, a men's halfway house located at 1747 South 900 West. Patients there were required to check in and out of the facility each time they left. In Justin's case, he did so frequently as he went off to work. On the morning of the 20th of November, he left the center. While making his way to work, he chatted with his mother on the phone, and they made arrangements for lunch that day. The two planned to meet up near his construction job at Intermountain Medical Center, but Justin never showed up for lunch with his mother, and he never checked back into the facility where he was living. This marked the beginning of an enduring mystery. After realizing that her son was missing, Justin's mother recalled something strange. After the two had spoken on the phone, she tried to call him back. This was within 5 minutes of hanging up, but his phone was mysteriously turned off. That evening, she would also discover that he was listed as a fugitive for failing to return to the center. Justin's mother reported him missing to the police, who classified and treated the case as though the missing man was an absconder of parole. The listing remained as such until late 2019, when his case was finally reclassified as a missing person. It isn't known if Justin's case was investigated initially, or what search efforts were deployed for the missing 27-year-old. By the time the case was reclassified, it was likely too late. Any potential evidence was gone, and his name faded into obscurity. In 2021, though, it made a reappearance following an alleged tip, claiming that the man had been the victim of homicide, a suggestion that couldn't be verified. But with this tip, police began to suspect foul play. The circumstances surrounding the disappearance remain unclear. The Utah Cold Case Coalition has offered $5,000 for information that may lead to Justin's whereabouts, but no such information has surfaced. In March of 2019, Muhammad Ashraf Hasan, known to his friends as ACAP, was one of several hundred runners who participated in the Gopeng Ultra Trail Challenge that was held in Gopeng, in the Perak state of Malaysia. The runners could choose how much of the forested course they wanted to run, with the available options being 6.2, 15.5, 31, or 62 miles, which equates to 10, 25, 50, or 100 kilometers. ACAP hailed from the town of Muar, and he was an experienced runner who would normally have completed his chosen 15-mile run with ease. He reported to the starting line at 7:30 a.m., along with his few fellow joggers, and set out on the trail. He knew that it would be a challenging task, since the trail weaves through the jungle and is comprised mostly of dirt roads and tracks. There was also the matter of a steep climb to the peak, and on that day, the weather would have made it even harder, as it was very hot and humid, but ACAP would have been accustomed to these conditions. He was seen several times on the trail, and was confirmed to have reached the 6th checkpoint, which lay just over 3 miles from the finish line, about 2 hours after he had set off. One runner would later report that he spoke to ACAP, since he asked him to take a photo of him at the top of the peak. Hence, it's known that he did indeed reach the peak, and that he was still in good shape by that point. This makes what happened next all the more perplexing. The cutoff time for the run was 2 p.m., but when the signal was given, ACAP still hadn't arrived. A friend of his tried to contact him via text, but he got no response. And becoming concerned, he informed the event's organizers that ACAP was missing. The rest of that day was spent searching for him, but when night fell, no one had found any sign of him. ACAP was officially reported as missing that night, and the next morning, search efforts resumed. The local police, fire department, and hundreds of volunteers scoured the jungle, hoping that they would find some sign of the missing man, but to no avail. Forest rangers, canine units, the military, an abseiling team, and even ACAP's 62-year-old mother looked for him along the trail, focusing largely on the cave system area since it was just a short distance from the trail, and they had some luck when they came across his water bottle. But before long, heavy rains set in, and the search had to be suspended. Runners who had completed the course provided the police with photos and videos that showed ACAP jogging the final 3 miles of the trail, and the search was shifted to this area. But no further clues were ever found. The search was officially called off on the 30th of March, though small groups continued searching on their own without any results. The entire trail was searched once more by the Fire and Rescue Department in 2020, but again nothing was found. Foul play has not been ruled out, but it's more likely that he suffered from a heat stroke, got lost, or fell and got injured. But none of these theories have been proven, and ACAP's fate remains a mystery. It's well known that many government-owned institutions in South Africa, such as hospitals and care homes, are run under deplorable conditions. But without private health care, many of the country's citizens have no choice but to trust the doctors and nurses who work there. The Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Hospital in Durban is a regional hospital that's often inundated with patients who have to wait a very long time before they're treated, and if they're lucky, there will be a bed available if they need to be admitted. The 10th of May 2019 seemed like any other day at the hospital, but none of the staff could have imagined that they were about to become part of a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. 53-year-old Sandile Cibia arrived at the hospital that morning with quite the tale to tell. He was a construction worker who was in the process of helping his neighbor do some work on his house when a wall in the building collapsed on top of his leg, resulting in his right femur being broken. He was rushed to this very hospital by his family, despite the fact that he belonged to a private medical provider, likely because it was the closest option. Once there, he was assessed and given some treatment, but his medical aid provider then asked that he be transferred to a better facility, which was Addington Hospital, also in Durban. A nurse who had treated Sandile went to his room to check on him, but to her surprise, he was no longer there. The staff knew he couldn't have gotten far since his leg was broken, but despite searching the entire hospital, he was nowhere to be found. They contacted the police, and Sandile was reported missing. Further searches of the grounds and the surrounding area were carried out, but no further clues were found. Then, 2 weeks later, the unthinkable happened. Staff and patients at the hospital started complaining about an unbearable smell that they couldn't track down. But one person noticed a leak in one of the storerooms, but they were unable to figure out what was causing it. Maintenance workers were called in to check the pipes in the ceiling, and when they arrived, they discovered Sandile's body lying in the ceiling in the fetal position. An investigation ensued, but the police were unable to figure out how he had ended up there. Everyone involved was perplexed by the mystery, especially since it was eerily similar to another case that had taken place in Stellenbosch in 2017. In that case, a man named Teteke Kotsi was admitted to the Stellenbosch hospital since he was scheduled for abdominal surgery. A nurse saw him in his bed at 5:15 a.m. on the 5th of October that year, and she stepped out of his room for a minute to get new sheets for his bed, but when she returned, he was gone. She assumed he decided to check himself out, but she followed up with his family 2 days later, and they reported that they hadn't heard from him since his surgery. 2 weeks later, renovations were being done on an isolated part of the hospital, and in the ceiling, the men's remains were discovered. The police stated that both men passed away from natural causes, but they've been unable to explain what led them to this conclusion. In December of 1985, Diana Robertson had just celebrated her 21st birthday, and she, along with her 36-year-old boyfriend, Mike Reimer, and their young daughter, Crystal, decided to drive to the mountains in Tacoma, Washington to search for a Christmas tree. They decided to start their hunt in a forested area south of Tacoma, since it was a well-known camping spot that attracted a lot of visitors. Mike was an experienced outdoorsman and trapper, and while in the area, he planned to check on a few traps that he had set earlier. It seemed like it would be a nice outing for the family, but at some point, something went horribly wrong. Crystal was spotted later that day at a department store in Tacoma, but she was alone. People who found her tried to get her to explain how she got there and where her parents were, but she remained silent and seemed to be in shock. She was taken to a hospital where she was evaluated and then sent to a temporary foster home while the police tried to find Diana and Mike, though investigators didn't know at this point that they were the girls' parents. 3 days went by with no developments until Diana's mother, Louise, saw Crystal's photo on a news broadcast, and she contacted the police. Crystal was handed over to her and at last felt comfortable enough to start talking, but she couldn't explain where her parents were and merely stated Mommy was in the trees. Searches were conducted by foot and from the air, but not knowing exactly where to search, no clues were found. 2 months later, a dog walker found Diana's remains in the forest, lying on the ground next to Mike's truck. She'd been attacked with a sharpened blade, and after the police were informed, Mike's truck was found to have biological material on the front seat, but he was nowhere to be seen. Since it had been there so long, it could only be determined that it was human, but no DNA analysis could be performed. Strangely, they also found an envelope in the vehicle which contained a note that read, quote, "I love you, Diana." Louise was shown the note, and she believes it was written by Mike since it was signed in his customary manner. It was speculated that Mike may have left the note to apologize for ending Diana's life, or that the real attacker had left it there to confuse the police. It was then revealed that 2 people, Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper, had been attacked in Pierce County 15 miles away 4 months earlier, and both of their lives had been ended. That was another area where Mike used to set traps, and so he became the #1 suspect. Both crime scenes contained similar pieces of evidence, and so it was assumed that the same person was responsible. Mike was known to have a violent temper, and Diana's sister had reported that he'd assaulted Diana on several occasions. A warrant was issued for Mike's arrest, but no one had any idea where he might have fled to. 26 years later, parts of Mike's remains were found by a hiker about a mile from the spot where Diana was attacked. Since so much time had passed, it could not be determined how he lost his life, and this mystery is one that may never be solved. 23-year-old Alonzo Brooks was born in Topeka, Kansas in 1980. In April of 2004, he was employed as a custodian for the Countryside Maintenance Company in Gardner, Kansas, and his life seemed to be going well, according to those who knew him. But on the 3rd of April that year, things would take the worst possible turn. Alonzo had attended a party in Lasagne with 3 of his friends, but at some point during the night, tensions started to rise when he got into an argument with a few of the other attendees. He and his friends remained at the gathering for a while, but they then started to leave at different times. Thanks to a misunderstanding about who would be giving Alonzo a ride home, his friends ended up accidentally leaving him behind. When he didn't return home as expected, his family traveled to the area where the party was held, and when they couldn't find him, they contacted the police to report that he had gone missing. The Lynn County Sheriff's Office conducted a search, but when it was unsuccessful, Alonzo's case was handed over to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. The FBI also became involved, but despite their best efforts, they were unable to find any trace of him. It wasn't until the 1st of May that year that Alonzo's family was given permission to search the property where the party was held, and almost immediately, they found his body next to Middle Creek, which runs past the party house. A medical examiner found no signs that he'd been attacked or that he was involved in a struggle, and so the cause of his passing could not be determined. It was later revealed that one of his friends had left the party to buy cigarettes, but he got lost along the way and never returned to get Alonzo as promised. It was also revealed that when his friends returned to the house to look for him the next day, they found his hat and boots on the ground across the street, but failed to locate him. Strangely, the area was searched by investigators at the time, but Alonzo's body wasn't found. His friends and family had strong suspicions that his passing had something to do with the earlier altercation, but they had no way of proving that theory. They would add that when they found his remains, his body was in plain sight, and his belongings, as well as his remains, were undamaged by the elements. This raised many questions, since he would have been next to the creek for almost a month before being found. This suggested someone had ended his life elsewhere, and then returned his body to the creek later on. But again, there was no proof of this. Many people believe that someone who was in attendance that night knows what happened, and that they may have remained silent for reasons unknown. The investigation into this case is still ongoing, and the hope is that someone will come forward with relevant information so that Alonzo's family can finally learn what happened to him that night. The case involving a woman named Fala Lee is one that has sparked many theories after her life was ended, but despite all this speculation, her case remains unsolved. In 2006, Fala was 21 years old, and she was a studying nurse at the St. Vincent's Hospital, School of Nursing in Germany, which is also where she was born in 1985. Those who knew her well described her as an outgoing and kind person who took her responsibilities, including her studies, very seriously. Her friends say that she used to light up the room whenever she entered one, and she was almost always in a good mood. At the time, she was living in an apartment with her ex-boyfriend, Chris. The pair were still good friends despite the relationship having failed, and by all accounts, she had a very bright future ahead of her. On the 20th of June that year, Fala and a few of her friends visited a bar called Old Triangle, where they had a few drinks and watched England play against Germany in the Football World Cup. Her friends would later report that she was in a good mood, as per usual, and that she decided to head home at around 11 p.m. She told them that she was planning on going straight home, and this would have only taken her a few minutes since she lived very close by. Chris noticed that she didn't come home that night, but he assumed that she decided to stay over at one of her other friends' houses. She then sent a text saying that she would be home late, but when he was unable to get a hold of her on the phone, he started to worry something was wrong. When Fala failed to show up for work, her family's concerns grew, and they contacted the police. Several people searched for her to no avail, but then the case took a very strange turn. For a few days after she went missing, Fala would phone her family members. All of these calls were very short, and while she sounded calm, her demeanor had changed, and she refused to answer any questions, including where she was. But she did state that she'd be home soon, but her family immediately suspected that she was being held captive by someone who was listening to all of these calls, and hence she couldn't give out any information. She made one final call on the 27th of June, in which she promised she'd be home soon, but that was the last time that anyone heard from her. Some sources state that during an earlier call, she was asked whether she was being held captive, and she softly answered yes, but this was followed by a loud no. Then, on the 4th of October, a hunter contacted the police to report that he'd found a set of remains in the woods, about 12 miles from her hometown. They were eventually confirmed to belong to Fala, and her family was left devastated. It was determined that she'd been deceased for some time, and while the cause of her passing could not be determined, it's believed that she had in fact been held captive for quite some time before her life was ended. Many people believed that the perpetrator was someone she knew, since he allowed her to contact her loved ones from time to time. Despite all this speculation, no suspects were ever identified, and Fala's case remains an unsolved mystery that Germany is unlikely to forget anytime soon. 45 years have passed since 38-year-old Maria James lost her life at the hands of an unknown criminal in 1980, and today the police are no closer to identifying a suspect. A $1 million reward is now being offered to anyone who comes forward with information leading to her case being solved, but only time will tell whether this has any effect. At the time, Maria owned a bookstore in Thornbury's High Street in Melbourne, Australia. She also lived in the building with her two sons, and according to the surrounding community, she was well liked, but she chose her friends carefully and only had a few. She was a devoted mother who would do anything for her two sons, and the bookstore provided her with the income that she needed to care for them. According to witnesses, Maria was in the store on the morning of the 17th of June that year, and her ex-husband John would later report that he received a text from her, asking him to call her. She added that someone was in the store with her and that she needed to speak to him urgently. He did as she asked, and when she answered the phone, she asked him to hold on while she spoke to the person in the store. He heard her speaking to someone, but couldn't follow the conversation. But by her tone, he could hear it wasn't a casual exchange. She never returned to her phone, and so he decided to leave work and go to the store to see what was going on. When he arrived, the store was empty. The sign on the door was still turned to open, but both the front and back doors were locked. He decided to break in, and when he did, he found Maria deceased in her bedroom. She'd been attacked with a sharpened blade, and her hands were tied. He decided to contact the police, and to his surprise, when he left the store, he discovered that the front door was now unlocked, leading him to believe that Maria's attacker was still in the building when he entered. During the resulting investigation, 2 people reported seeing a man running away from the store mere moments after John had entered. They provided descriptions of this man to the police, but he was never identified and remains on the run today. In an effort to drum up more leads, the police made several appeals to the public for information, but none was ever received. Thanks to the descriptions, a police sketch of the attacker was created, and this led many people to believe that a local priest named Anthony Bongiorno was the culprit. Peter Koff had also been a suspect since he'd ended the life of another woman in Melbourne, but neither man was ever charged due to a lack of evidence. To date, no further clues have been found, no additional witnesses have been identified, and Maria's case continues to baffle the police, who have vowed to continue investigating in hopes that justice will be done one day. Spirited Away is one of the most famous anime movies ever made. The events that occur in the story are based on some Japanese folklore and spiritual beliefs, and the disappearance of a woman named Noriko Shizuka is often spoken about whenever the film is mentioned, since she seemed to have been spirited away. Japanese folklore holds that if a person were to anger the gods somehow, they will, on occasion, kidnap them and hide them from the rest of the world. They will have, in essence, been spirited away, never to return. The case of 48-year-old Noriko Shizuka's disappearance began in 1998 in the Gunma Prefecture of Japan. It's an area that's known for the production of fine cognac, and it's situated close to Tokyo. It's also known for its beautiful shrines that are visited by tourists and locals alike. On the 3rd of May that year, Shizuka, who hailed from the Chiba Prefecture, joined her family on a trip to Gunma, where they planned to look at azaleas that were growing there. She was in the company of her husband, daughter, aunt, uncle, mother-in-law, and grandson. The weather had been threatening rain all morning, and after they arrived at around 11:30 a.m., a storm broke out. This meant that they would not be able to see the azaleas, and so her husband and uncle decided to visit the Akagi Shrine instead, while the rest of the family stayed behind. At around midday, Shizuka decided that she wanted to place some coins on the shrine, and she got out of the car that they were waiting in. Her family stated that she took 101 yen with her, and that she then braved the rain to get to the shrine. She was easy to spot since she was dressed in a pink shirt, black skirt, blue sandals, and carried a bright red umbrella. At some point, her daughter looked out of the car window to see where Shizuka was, but to her surprise, she was facing away from the shrine for reasons unknown. She'd only walked about 100 yards from the car and was standing in the rain. According to witnesses, she almost seemed frozen and seemed to be unnaturally still. Shizuka's daughter got distracted by her son for mere seconds, and when she looked back at the spot where her mother was standing, she'd vanished. It's believed she intended to go to the shrine for a few minutes, since she left her bag and purse in the car. Furthermore, she wore hearing aids that helped battle bouts of dizziness, and when she left the car, she didn't take them with her. She also never entered the area where the shrine is located, since neither her husband nor her uncle saw her, which would have been impossible had she walked any further in their direction. While the area wasn't crowded, several people were around the shrine at the time, but no one had seen Shizuka. The police conducted searches for 10 days with no positive results. Sniffer dogs searched the surrounding mountains to no avail, and more than 100 people aided in the search efforts, but nothing further was found. In 2019, 33-year-old Kate Brown and 40-year-old Carnell Sledge had been friends for a very long time. They loved spending time in each other's company, which is what they were doing on the late afternoon of the 4th of June of that year. It's known that Kate had struggled with alcohol addiction in the past, but she managed to turn her life around, and at the time had been sober for more than 2 years. She was doing exceedingly well, as she'd lost more than 100 pounds, and according to her family, she was loving the way her life had turned out. As for Carnell, he's described as very popular, since he was the type of person who wouldn't think twice about helping someone in need. And according to his friends, he'd done so on many occasions. On the 4th of June that year, the pair decided to spend some time together, and they did in the Rocky River Reservation in Cleveland Metro Parks. Later that afternoon, they decided to sit down on a park bench where they no doubt continued chatting, but were then attacked and both of their lives were ended. When the police arrived, they determined that they'd been attacked with a firearm in what they believed to be an isolated incident. Kate was no stranger to the park since she lived nearby and would often spend time there relaxing or exercising. But what struck investigators as strange was the fact that the attack was carried out while it was still light out and in an area where several people were walking around. In fact, this area was unusually busy that day, and yet no one saw or heard the attack when it occurred. The area was scoured for clues, but none were found. The police had only one option: to appeal for witnesses to come forward, but when that failed to produce any leads, a $20,000 reward was offered. Kate and Carnell's families added more money to this, and eventually the reward went up to $100,000. Still, no one came forward, and it seemed as though the case would never be solved. But then, something unexpected happened. A few months after the attack, an anonymous letter was sent to a Fox 8 I-team in which the author mentioned specific details about the day that the pair lost their lives in the park, including a description of the attacker. The writer stated that the attacker was a brunette woman who was wearing a green hoodie, blue cuffed jeans with white socks, and black sneakers. They added that the woman walked up to the pair at the bench and after speaking to them for a short while, suddenly produced a firearm and ended their lives. The letter was turned over to the police, but they later stated that this was not enough information to identify a suspect. Investigators and both families have made subsequent appeals to the author of the letter to come forward, since they could have further information that could help solve the case. But to this day, they've chosen to remain silent for reasons unknown. It could be that they know the attacker and are scared that they will also be attacked, or that they simply don't want to get involved in the case any further. Whatever the case may be, they've never been identified, and without their help, many people believe the case will go cold and will likely never be solved. In June of 1995, the Oslo Plaza Hotel in Norway became the scene of a strange mystery that remains unsolved today. And it's become a case that continues to intrigue amateur sleuths and investigators to this day. According to staff at the hotel, the evening of the 31st of May of that year was as unremarkable as most. People were checking into the hotel as per the usual, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the day was about to take an inexplicable turn. 3 days earlier, a woman named Jennifer Fairgate had checked into the hotel. Her check-in details showed that she hailed from Belgium, and strangely, she wasn't asked to provide a credit card number for payment. She was given room number 2805, and for the next 3 days, she was considered just another guest among the hundreds that were staying at the establishment. But 3 days after she arrived, one of the hotel's employees, a security guard, knocked on her room door to ask for payment, and to their shock, they were greeted by the sound of a firearm being discharged. They immediately informed the hotel's manager, who contacted the police. They arrived about 15 minutes later, and when they entered the room, they found Jennifer deceased, having been attacked with a firearm that was heard through the door. As the investigation began, it was quickly determined that the woman had used an alias to check in, and that the Belgian address she provided didn't exist. The card that she signed upon check-in was checked, and according to one investigator, the last name used looked more like Fergate rather than Fairgate, leading many people to believe that this was her real last name. Furthermore, the card showed that she'd be sharing a room with someone named Lois Fairgate, but none of the staff ever saw her with anyone. And when the room was searched, no evidence was found that a second person had been staying there. One guest at the hotel did state that they saw her with a man at some point, but the police never checked the building's CCTV cameras, and so this claim was never confirmed. Investigators were baffled by the fact that the woman had the firearm in her hand when she was found, but she clearly wasn't the one who fired it, since she had no biological material on her hands. Just as baffling is the fact that all the labels had been removed from her clothes, and that only clothes for the top half of her body were found in the room. The shower had been used, but she had no toiletries or makeup with her. Her bags didn't contain any type of identification, and in a briefcase, investigators found several rounds of ammunition. She left the room for about 20 hours at one point, as was evidenced by her keycard information. a housekeeper, would later confirm that when she entered the room at some point, the woman wasn't there. It was eventually discovered that she likely hailed from East Germany and was 24 years old, thanks to DNA and a C14 analysis. Many people believed that she was a secret agent who checked into the hotel and that she was tracked down by enemies who ended her life. This seems to explain why the tags were removed from her clothes and why the serial number on the firearm had been filed down. Many questions remain in this mystery, but in the years that have passed, no further clues have been found, and the Oslo Plaza woman's true identity remains unknown. The night of the 15th of January was an extremely cold one in Hazard, Kentucky. It had been snowing, and temperatures had dropped to below freezing. Most people decided to remain indoors since the roads in the area were quickly becoming impassable. But the nasty weather didn't deter 21-year-old Joel Wells and his friends, who had traveled to the Black Gold shopping center where they were hanging out. But the local residents had another reason to remain behind locked doors. The previous night, a gas station attendant was attacked and their life was ended. This caused a lot of fear in the area, and hence most people refrained from going out after sunset. At some point during the night, the group of friends was seen talking in the car in the parking lot of a Walmart at the center. Joel's friends would later reveal that an argument broke out, and Joel decided to storm off, after which they never saw him again. At least one witness would report seeing him walking alone in the same parking lot. He was then seen later that night by another witness who stated that he seemed to be in a state of panic since he was trying to get into parked vehicles without success. They added that he seemed not only frantic but confused, and from their perspective it seemed as though he was trying to get away from someone who was after him, though they saw no one else. When this witness was asked why they didn't help Joel, they stated that they, along with the rest of the community, were hesitant to help anyone they didn't know, given what had happened the previous night. A short while later, the police got a call from staff at a Burger King restaurant in the area. They reported that a man, now known to be Joel, had started banging on the restaurant's doors. The restaurant was already closed for the night, and its staff was busy cleaning up when Joel arrived. They refused to open the doors since they were wary of strangers, so they resorted to calling the police and stated that Joel seemed to be in distress, as if he was being chased by someone. When they arrived, though, Joel was nowhere to be seen. According to witnesses, Joel then returned to the Walmart, where he asked several people for a ride home, but they understandably declined. Joel never came home, and the following morning they reported him as missing. The police immediately started a search with the aid of sniffer dogs, and they were able to pick up his scent. They followed the trail to the edge of a riverbank where the scent disappeared. Investigators believe that if he ended up in the water, he'll likely never be found. Thanks to a photo provided by Joel's family, the Burger King staff were able to confirm that he was the man who was banging on the doors that night. His family is certain that he met with foul play, likely at the hands of people with whom he was in the car with that night, but no evidence has ever been found to prove this. Drifting off the Atlantic coast of Scotland is a group of islands subdivided into two main parts. The Inner Hebrides lies to the east, while the Outer Hebrides are to the west. Both sides are separated by channels known as the Mensch and Little Mensch. The Outer Hebrides finds itself administered as the Western Isles Council area and has seen a significant depopulation due to the lack of economic opportunities. Nevertheless, the remaining residents make the most of their lives on the islands. At first, life there seemed peaceful until earlier this year. Since the start of 2025, the island's quiet has been greatly disrupted by something truly bizarre that has left experts puzzled. An unknown low-frequency humming noise has spread across the island, souring the days and nights of the inhabitants, particularly 200 of them. These 200 sufferers reside on the Isle of Lewis and have complained about the strange disembodied humming sound. Some say that they can't focus. Others report fluttering sounds in their ears, headaches, and even dizziness. By April, a Facebook page was established in support of the victims of the Outer Hebrides hum, a 50 Hz sound that has only become louder and significantly more intrusive. Residents are becoming distressed and even feel isolated when they hear the sound. Figuring out what this noise may be has become crucial to the inhabitants, who haven't been able to sleep properly for weeks at a time. Several amateurs and experts have tried to trace the source, but to no avail. One such person was Marcus Hazel McGowan, who made use of amateur radio techniques. Despite his efforts, though, the source of the sound remains enigmatic. Scientists, residents, and researchers have all come up with their theories, some of which take a dark turn. One of the theories referred to an electrical company's Battery Point power station located in Stornoway. But this idea was quickly ruled out, since the station doesn't operate continuously, and the humming noise has been reported as a constant issue. Some suggested a TV mast, or even tinnitus. Boats and ferries were also investigated, along with mating fish, but none of these ideas could be confirmed. Taking on a more sinister narrative was the idea of a secret submarine lurking in the waters nearby. One individual even suggested that the residents may be hearing the earth turning. Despite all these theories, experts haven't been able to confirm what is causing the tormenting sound. Today, the residents of Outer Hebrides are still being plagued by that mysterious hum. As 20 people squashed onto a 29-foot Mako Cuddy cabin boat, no one could have imagined the sinister mystery that was about to unfold. The blue and white vessel departed from Bimini at the start of 2021. It was bound for the Bahamas, a destination at which it would never arrive. They had ignored the warnings and the stories about the Bermuda Triangle and ventured straight into it. They should have arrived in the Bahamas that day, but by Tuesday, it was clear that something was wrong. Bahamian authorities got a hold of the United States Coast Guard and alerted them that 20 people and a Mako Cuddy cabin had vanished. Bizarrely, the names of the people on board were never publicly released, leaving possible identification difficult to come by. It was known that the boat had drifted off the coast and made its way to Lake Worth, but once it was in the mystical section, bounded by Puerto Rico, Bermuda, and Miami, something went wrong and the vessel would never be seen again. Several divisions scoured the area in search for the missing people. 84 hours and 17,000 square miles later, they finally decided to suspend the effort. The rough waters and limited information on the boaters made the rescue operation especially challenging. Experts from HC-144 Ocean Sentry Aircrew, C-130 Hercules Aircrew, the U.S. Air Force, Coast Guard cutters, and the Royal Bahamas Defense Force and the Bahamas Air Sea Rescue Association were all involved in the efforts to locate the vessel and those aboard, but no clues would reveal themselves. There was no debris, no bodies, nothing. Not until a whole 6 months later. It was the 24th of June, 2021, when a sinister discovery was made off the coast of Turks and Caicos. Fishermen had spotted a lonesome boat, unsteered, drifting in the water. Royal Turks and Caicos Islands police force towed it ashore, and what they found on board was incredibly disturbing. Strewn across the deck were 20 bodies of deceased individuals, but again, their identities wouldn't be released. Were they the crew of the missing Mako Cuddy cabin boat, or was this a different incident? Police discounted foul play as the COD for these victims and began exploring other alternatives, but still hadn't arrived at a plausible conclusion. Making this mystery even more bizarre is that the boat on which they were found wasn't the missing cabin boat. It was a different small vessel, which supposedly hadn't been reported missing. As of 2025, no official explanation for either of these harrowing events has been released. Experts have been left scratching their heads and are appealing to the public for information. The most heartbreaking and frustrating mysteries of all are those involving people, often leaving us with unanswered questions about what happened to them. Often, these enigmas can revolve around inexplicable homicides or passings, but in the case of Christopher Metallic, his fate remains shrouded in mystery. The story began to unfold on the 25th of November, 2012, when Chris was just 20 years old, a student studying anthropology at Mount Allison University. Known for his friendly demeanor, he was well liked among his classmates and was eager to start his adult life. His future, though, would come to an abrupt halt on that one Saturday evening. It was that night that he and some friends headed to an off-campus party, which was being held at a nearby residence. It was a common tradition among university students to unwind after a long week. It comes as no shock that intoxicating beverages were in abundance, and as the night drew on, Chris joined his friends in drinking. As the clock ticked further towards Sunday, uncertainty began to set in. Chris, feeling the effects of the evening, stepped outside of the home and stumbled around in the cool air. He continued to walk into the quiet of the night in the small Canadian town of Sackville. His destination was unknown, but he was walking. That evening endeavor marked the last time that Chris would be in the presence of family and friends. Unbeknownst to them, as he walked, disappearing into the night, he would vanish, leaving behind an unsettling sense of unease. The first sighting of him was when Chris left the home and was traveling near the Tantramar River. Witnesses later recalled seeing a disoriented man lingering around a pizza business on Main Street. That was at 3 a.m. This sighting would be the last time that anyone would see Chris. He was gone after that, his fate unknown. Hours leaked into days, and each moment only instilled more panic and confusion began to mount. Worried that he hadn't returned home, the family made contact with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and members of the Tri-County Ground Search and Rescue. With concerned family members and friends in tow, they scoured the area tirelessly. They combed the nearby woods, shortcuts he may have taken, and places he was known to frequent, but there was nothing. Despite the exhaustive efforts, no clues materialized. Investigators would turn to surveillance footage and social media, hoping that someone saw something. But again, there was nothing. Days passed, and the distressed reality began to set in. Missing person posters began to flood Sackville, sheets of paper stapled to lamps with a picture of Chris on display. The university even sent out an email to students and staff, claiming he was last seen at Home Alone Pizza, hoping it may jog someone's memory. But again, it seemed that no one saw anything at all. By the following week, police still had no tips from the public. Chris had vanished without a trace. The family struggled to comprehend how someone so vibrant and eager for life could disappear so easily. Investigators were wondering the same thing. Days became weeks, and the mystery only continued to deepen. Billboards and signs appeared ominously all over Sackville, reminding us of a case that's left experts perplexed. The lack of answers in this case would continue to haunt the community, but hope remained that one day, clarity would be found in the darkness that swallowed Chris. Years later, the case lingers on, particularly in the minds of family, friends, and the detectives who couldn't figure it out. Where is Christopher Metallic? Kota Ramaswamy came from an important cricket family in India. Even in the 1930s, it would have been difficult for him to stand out among his successful relatives, including a father who was known as the father of South Indian cricket. Ramaswamy did just that with an impressive sports career, but he unfortunately became known for another part of his life, his mysterious disappearance in October of 1985. Ramaswamy was born in Madras, India in 1896. He was the youngest son of Buchi Babu Naidu, a cricketer who made the sport popular in the country. As Naidu promoted the sport to other Indians, his own sons also became interested in the game. Both of Ramaswamy's brothers also went into the sport. Ramaswamy himself played at a young age, but when he went to Cambridge University to study, his attention was turned to a different sport. He swapped the bat for a racket and took up tennis, winning competitions around the country. In 1922, he represented India on the international stage in the Davis Cup, making it through to the second round. That same year, he played in the Wimbledon Championships. When he finished his studies, Ramaswamy returned to the sport he became famous for. He played first-class cricket until 1942, when he was well into his 40s. In 1936, he was selected for the Indian cricket team's tour of England and made his first Test match appearance at the age of 40. It made him the second oldest Indian to make this Test match debut. Ramaswamy saw himself as past his prime at this point and believed he'd been selected for non-cricket seasons. That didn't help him from putting in an impressive performance, scoring 40 and 60 on debut. The matches also made him one of only 4 Indian cricketers to have played internationally in another sport. After retiring as a player, Ramaswamy remained an important figure in cricket circles. He managed the Indian cricket team as they played in the West Indies in 1952 and 53, and also worked as a selector. Ramaswamy continued to give interviews to sports writers, even as late as 1984, when he was well into his 80s. According to one journalist, he spoke confidently about his experience as a player and as a selector. He needed to be prompted for some memories, but didn't appear to have any mental health issues or significant physical health problems that might have prompted his disappearance. The disappearance came on October 15, 1986. He left his home in Adyar, where he lived with his wife, and simply never returned. Unfortunately, there's no details about what Ramaswami was wearing at the time of his disappearance, or where he may have intended to go. His family reported him missing shortly after, and a search for the famous cricketer began. Some believe Ramaswami intentionally disappeared. He was 89 years old at the time, and may have wanted to avoid being a burden to his family. For years afterward, there were reported sightings of the celebrity sportsman, but none could be confirmed. Cricket record books listed him as having presumably passed away, but this was stopped after 1991. More recent record books have him listed as passing away in January of 1990. No one would have been prepared for the mystery that would follow after the police responded to a report of a drinking party at 810 West Main Street, Palmyra, Pennsylvania. It was the 28th of July, 2012, when law enforcement arrived at the apartment where 21-year-old Courtney Stoofer and Brad Herr were living. Brad and 7 others were arrested, leaving Courtney there alone. 2 of the partygoers would be cited for a drinking violation and soon released. An hour later, just a few minutes past 10 p.m., Courtney would receive a message from friends. Cody Pruitt and Milton Rodriguez were at a bar in Hummelstown and wanted the young woman to join them. Interested in continuing her party, she agreed and climbed into her car. She parted at the gas station bar and joined friends there. Together, they would head to Harrisburg, where the hardware bar was located. Their partying went all night and led into the early morning hours of July 29th. It was at 1:50 that morning that Courtney would be involved in a minor and brief altercation, allegedly with the girlfriend of Arvard Brown. After being asked to leave a hardware bar due to the disturbance, Courtney would briefly separate from her friends. They soon reconnected and headed to a local shop for pizza and then returned to their car. Just under an hour later, the friend group was back in Palmyra, with Cody being named the designated driver for a car owned by Milton. Arvard and his girlfriend were the first to be dropped off at their residence. Then it was Milton. Cody then agreed to take Courtney back to the gas station bar, where she could retrieve her vehicle. To ensure her safety, Cody followed her home. At 3 a.m., they arrived at the apartment again, and it was here that the woman would get into a second altercation of that evening. Under the influence, she and her neighbors got into a back and forth, suspecting that they may have been the ones to report her drinking party. Just moments later, the police arrived at the scene after the neighbor called them, alleging that threats were made against him. Eventually, things settled down, and both parties went their separate ways. Just over an hour later, the police would arrive at the residence again for the 3rd time that evening. This time, a different neighbor had contacted them, alleging that Courtney was screaming through the walls and making a ruckus. They knocked on the door, peered through the windows, and heard a dog barking inside, but no one came to the door. The police left, and the night went eerily quiet. A few hours later, at around 8 a.m., Cody allegedly searched for Courtney and left soon after, having not found her. He headed to a local Sheetz and bought something. All seemed to be in good order when the sun came up, and the previous night's fiasco was nothing more than a blur. But then at 2:42 p.m., something peculiar would happen. Scott Stoofer reported Courtney missing. Police arrived at the residence yet again, only to find the door open and nothing else inside except for an abandoned dog. The 21-year-old was nowhere to be seen, her last official contact being made at 3:30 that morning when police responded to the complaint. Courtney's vehicle was left at the apartment, along with her purse, shoes, money, and cell phone. Aside from her personal effects being left behind, there were no other indications of foul play or something sinister that had taken place here. But it seems obvious that something bad did indeed happen here, because 13 years later, there's still no trace of Courtney Stoofer. Police would go on to search several of the neighbors' homes and even did a forensic analysis on her vehicle, but these efforts proved futile. Some believe that the disturbance heard by the neighbor may have been Courtney trying to fight off her attacker. If this were the case, Cody would have seen something, unless he was the attacker. The friend, though, was cleared of suspicion and had allegedly left a note in the apartment before leaving. He also phoned Courtney sometime later. Adding another layer of creepiness to this mystery was that, along with the woman, a rug from her apartment was missing and has never been found. 3 years later, Courtney's mother was still putting up flyers of her missing daughter, especially around her old neighborhood, but the missing woman's neighbor didn't take kindly to the posters and allegedly tossed them in the garbage. The family maintains that she would never have just walked away, and certainly wouldn't have left her dog behind. Her case was certainly suspicious and remains inexplicable today. Human heart found in Tennessee salt pile. It was a harrowing and confounding headline that dominated the remainder of 2022. Workers of the Tennessee Department of Transportation filed into work on the 15th of December that year, expecting to start preparing for the coming snowstorm in McGowan. Their job was to prepare the brine that would be used to cover the roads with the forecast predicting icy and dangerous conditions. Salt was being added to the mix by the bucket load, but the workers soon discovered that they didn't have enough salt for what was needed. So one of the employees headed out of the salt barn, where he immediately came across something peculiar. It was a strange-looking rock the size of a tennis ball. It was laying on the floor of the barn, among piles of salt. Perhaps it accidentally ended up in one of the bags or containers. It wasn't until the workers took a closer look that he realized this was no rock at all. Instead, he would come upon the harrowing realization it was a heart. Shocked by what he had discovered, he immediately rang the police department, who arrived at the scene shortly after. As they stepped into the barn, experts squatted next to it, examining it, and finally they made the terrifying conclusion. It wasn't just any heart, it was human. The heart was quickly taken to the laboratory where it would undergo an autopsy, and it was here that several things would be discovered. Through a tissue sample, they were able to figure out that it belonged to a male and had been removed through a surgical procedure. What they couldn't figure out, though, was who it belonged to or how it got there in the first place. The heart was dehydrated due to the salt, which made it impossible to figure out how long it had been there, but it had been there for quite some time, at least several weeks. The nature of this discovery was just so bizarre that law enforcement had no other choice but to label this a homicide investigation. The remains would be nicknamed the Humphreys County John Doe. Thereafter, the salt barn would be closed, and it was considered a crime scene. Despite thoroughly searching through the salt, as well as around the barn, no other human remains were discovered, making this finding all the more perplexing. Investigators then tried to track down the origins of the salt, but this too proved difficult, since the company draws salt from at least 20 different facilities in the United States. As experts attempted to put a host to the heart, the news was being leaked to the public. Understandably, the shocking headlines baffled all who read them. Several theories would spark, some suggesting an ancient burial that was disturbed through salt mining. But this was not the case. Road salt is sent through slicers, which would have destroyed the organ. Another theory suggested that a scavenger may have dropped it there, but the barn was covered by a roof, and such creatures don't generally have the habit of burying their food in salt piles. More probable hypotheses in place of the homicide and scavenger theory were that it was incorrectly disposed of by a funeral home or a medical specimen facility, or it was hidden there intentionally as a seriously dark and disturbing prank. Investigations are still ongoing in the Humphreys County John Doe case, but experts still haven't been able to answer the eerie questions that linger. Was this the work of a precise slayer? Was it improper disposal or something far more sinister? We may never know. Something unnerving began happening off the coast of South Africa. Since early 2017, great white sharks, the third largest shark and predatory fish, had begun washing ashore. They were deceased with large wounds and missing livers. It was a grisly and unnerving sight, one that implied some sort of large oceanic creature was targeting this apex predator. In the years to follow, with the trend still ongoing, experts suggested that the beached shark remains coincided with sightings of a pair of male orcas named Starboard and Port, both of whom have collapsed dorsal fins. It wouldn't be until May of 2022 that experts would confirm their suspicions after a helicopter pilot and a drone flew over Mossel Bay. Starbird, accompanied by 4 other orca whales, was on the hunt for great white sharks, and they were successful too. Videos captured the moment that these aggressive sea beasts targeted, tracked, and slaughtered a great white shark. For most of the 2000s, orca whales have been exhibiting increasingly bizarre behaviors, including attacking boats and people, which they weren't previously known to do. These whales, staying true to their alternative name, are changing and adapting far quicker than experts can keep up. They establish new trends quickly, and for seemingly no reason at all. Although experts were able to suggest some theories when it came to increased orca boat encounters, the consensus being curiosity, they haven't been able to figure out why the creatures are suddenly targeting and purposefully hunting down the apex predators. What makes this mystery even more terrifying is how the whales are capturing their unofficial prey. Experts watched as the group flipped a shark onto its back, inducing a trance-like immobility. They then opened the fish and devoured its liver. The orcas don't seem to need help either. In 2023, Starbird was seen operating alone and managed to subdue and consume a juvenile great white in just 2 minutes. The sudden behavior is causing concern among marine biologists, with questions being raised on how these newfound predation methods will impact the intricate ecosystems. Through observation, it was found that in response to the increase in attacks, the apex predators of the ocean are fleeing in fear. And if the topmost predators are fleeing, that's certainly a cause for concern. Previously, orcas have been documented as preying on smaller fish, dolphins, and seals before suddenly turning their attention to the biggest predatory fish. While there are theories attempting to explain the sudden trend, none of them are backed by science, leaving experts just as confused as we are, maybe even slightly unnerved. It's certainly a fishy homicidal mystery. It was the 21st of July in 2020 when a resident of Houston, Texas stumbled upon something truly disturbing. Located in a grassy patch at the 2000 block of Orange Street was the body of a deceased, unidentified individual. Nearby were several residential buildings, businesses, and even a high school. Whoever found her had stumbled upon a thing from nightmares. The remains were partially decomposed but not skeletal. Eye color and weight would prove difficult to determine because of this. NamUs and Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences both listed basic features of the Jane Doe. She's believed to have been between the ages of 45 and 70, stood about 5 feet tall, had long, partially gray hair with dark ends, and wore eyeglasses, though her eye color couldn't be determined. Due to the state of the remains, it was estimated she'd been there for just over a week. But given the humidity and heat of Texas, the decomposition rates may have been accelerated, also aided by the heavy rainfall at the time. The most distinct feature of all, one that would lead to her being named the Texas Butterfly Jane Doe, was a bright, colorful butterfly tattoo located on her outer calf. It had several shades of blue, red, and turquoise. The tattoo was large, taking up a significant amount of the woman's leg, with some ink fading noted. But the story of the Texas Butterfly Jane Doe was about to get even more strange. She was wearing pink athletic sneakers, stretchy black pants, and bizarrely yellow hospital-grade grip socks. Making it even more heartbreaking was the stronger-than-cancer short that she wore. Experts suggesting that Jane Doe was likely in remission, evident by not just the shirt but the hospital socks she was wearing. Hospitals generally tend to have a sock color policy. Certain colors indicate certain things. Generally, yellow suggested that the patient was at risk of falling. Law enforcement and forensic experts began trying to put a face to the remains and the information they had, beginning with some missing women. The first consideration was Tara Lee Blue, a woman who vanished in Center, Texas in 2001. She had brown eyes, strawberry blonde hair, scars on her legs, arms, and fingers, as well as several tattoos on various parts of her body. She was 30 years old when she disappeared. But Jane Doe wasn't Tara, and experts were forced to consider another. This time they landed on Maria Dolores Nelson, who vanished in 2019 from Franklin, Indiana. She had gray hair and brown eyes, was 5 feet 5 inches tall, but had no tattoos documented in her case. The next exclusion was Althea Linnell Rogers, who disappeared from Georgetown, Texas. She had brown hair, blue eyes, and a scar from a hysterectomy. She also had all her wisdom teeth removed and 2 upper molars. She vanished in 1985 at the age of 35, but the Jane Doe of Houston wasn't her either. Adding to the mystery was that experts were unable to do a facial reconstruction, so knowing what she may have looked like was impossible. Not much else has been disclosed to the public, including whether or not she was found with any personal belongings, who found her, and how. Experts thus far have been unable to determine who she was, why she was wandering the fields, and why no one was looking for her. Back in August of 2017, something peculiar was observed by the Global Gravitational Wave Observatory of the Advanced LIGO and Advanced Virgo detectors. It was the gravitational wave signal called GW170814, which originated from a coalescence of a binary black hole system. Put simply, a gravitational wave signal reveals the ripples in space-time, ones that are caused by cataclysmic cosmic occurrences. Often, these ripples are generated by the collision of black holes or neutron stars. In August of 2019, LIGO and Virgo celebrated their 3rd birthdays together when they detected another signal, but this one was bound to bring mystery. Labeled GW190814, this gravitational wave sent off a ripple that traveled all the way to planet Earth, an exceptional yet harrowing discovery. The two detectors recorded something truly bizarre. The coalescence was made up of a component that was 23 times the mass of the Sun, and another that was around 2.6 solar masses. The larger of the two was no doubt a black hole, but what did it collide with? This is the question that has experts scratching their heads. They suggested several possibilities to this special event. They suggested that it was a neutron star that collided with a black hole, which would mark the first time that a neutron star and a black hole binary was observed. This means that the mysterious cosmic object may be the most massive neutron star ever, the heaviest of which has been recorded as 2.5 solar masses. Alternatively, some scientists speculate the possibility of a black hole, one that is significantly smaller and could in fact be the smallest black hole, the smallest of which was recorded as 5 solar masses. The result of the collision was a final black hole that measured 25 times the mass of the Sun, located a whopping 800 million light-years away from Earth. Yet it was able to ripple towards Earth, where it was detected by the LIGO and Virgo. This event marked the most extreme mass ratio ever observed in gravitational wave events, with objects exhibiting a mass difference of a factor of 9. By mid-June of the following year, astronomers were still no closer to any answers, and were puzzled by what the mysterious object could have been. No one has seen anything like this before, making it a particularly daunting mystery, like something out of a trapped-in-space sci-fi movie. What is the object? Why the massive mass gap? And what threat may it pose to us? The questions are harrowing. Lisa Lynn Stone was born in Dallas, Texas, becoming the sister of 3 siblings in a close-knit family. High school was a breeze for Lisa, who wasn't just beautiful but bubbly and fun. During her high school career, she found a position on the drill team, which was a big deal in Texas at the time. Although her life was going extremely well, tragedy would strike the Stone family. It started with the unexpected passing of her sister, who was involved in a car accident. Her brother passed away shortly after from an incurable disease. Things were about to take a turn for Lisa again in the 1990s. One evening, she opted for a night out and headed to a club where she would meet the love of her life, Sherry. Sherry described their relationship as instantaneous. They struck up a random conversation and hit it off. It didn't take long before they were moving in together. Things were going well again for Lisa, but then heartache would strike again. Her mother would succumb to cancer. In the midst of grief, she would latch on to her father, a retired police officer who would pass away in 2005. At the same time, Lisa had lost her job at the newspaper ad sales company where she was working. But through the passing of her family, she'd inherited $300,000, all of which would strangely disappear by 2010. In the lead up to 2010, she'd been reconnected with former high school drill team classmates, most of whom were now active on Facebook. One of her friends went to lunch with Lisa, where she spoke of a failing relationship with Sherry. The friend urged her to get out of the partnership, but Lisa refused. At the time, the two were living in Lisa's home, which she had inherited from her family. Despite the hardships that she was facing, Lisa was still going strong and kept in contact with her remaining family and friend group. She conversed with them regularly through Facebook until one day when it abruptly stopped. It was the 4th of June in 2010 when Lisa spoke with a neighbor, telling her that she would take the trash out for her the following day. The two had spoken often and regularly helped one another out. The neighbor and Sherry, however, hardly exchanged more than a simple greeting. So when Sherry rang the neighbor the following day, it was truly bizarre. Sherry came bearing some distressing news. Lisa allegedly needed to undergo emergency gallbladder surgery, so she would be taking the trash out in her place. Days went by without anyone hearing from Lisa. Her Facebook was silent, and the friendly neighbor hadn't chatted to her, as she so often did. When one of the friends decided to push the matter further by phoning Sherry, she was told that Lisa had left town. This was uncharacteristic of the 51-year-old, who wouldn't have departed without telling anyone, but Sherry maintained that her partner wasn't missing but rather had simply left. A few days later, some of the friends headed over to the Dallas, Texas area home to inquire further about Lisa's sudden silence. There, Sherry would invite them in, claiming that her partner was expecting to be back that very evening. She ordered some pizza for dinner, and they all sat together waiting. Almost 2 hours later, there was still no Lisa. On the 20th of June, the concerned neighbor finally filed a missing person report, and the police arrived at the home. There, they spoke with Sherry, and just 5 days later allegedly closed the case, insisting that Lisa left of her own accord, given that there were no signs of foul play. 9 days later, the neighbor called the police again, asking them to conduct a welfare check, and when they arrived at the home, Sherry claimed that Lisa was at a funeral. So the Facebook friends turned into amateur detectives, and a full-blown witch hunt soon commenced. It began on the 2nd of July when one of them headed to the home, but on the way there, she'd spotted Sherry in Lisa's car, so she decided to follow her. She ended up driving down to a 7-Eleven store, allegedly stopping by the dumpster where she supposedly discreetly dumped a small suitcase. Once Sherry was out of sight, the friend retrieved the case and found several personal belongings with Lisa's name on them. The police department was her next stop, and they would agree to reopen the missing person case. After questioning Sherry further, more strange things began to reveal themselves, one of which was flat-out denial, and the insistence that Lisa was not missing, even though she left her car and her purse behind. The police then searched the home and found no evidence at all of what may have happened to the missing woman. In July, a tip would lead them to a grassy field in Hunt County, but nothing concrete was found there. Lisa's whereabouts remained unknown after that, and Sherry continued to exhibit some strange behavior. Most bizarrely, law enforcement was unable to tie her to a crime, and they couldn't prove or disprove that Lisa had left of her own accord. She simply disappeared into thin air, leaving friends, family, and investigators confused. In 2016, tens of millions of dollars were stolen from the Bangladesh Bank in an international heist that involved at least 4 countries on 2 continents. Rather than breaking into a physical location, the criminal in this case conducted their heist online. The SWIFT network is one of the ways that banks talk to one another. It's a secure, closed computer network that's primarily used to transfer money between different banks. The network itself is secure, with each financial institution having its own set of codes and credentials to identify and authenticate any transaction. Unfortunately, those codes and credentials are only as secure as the bank themselves. If employees at the bank accidentally provide the codes to someone, it's possible to use them to commit an attack. That's exactly what happened in February 2016. How exactly the criminals got their hands on the codes isn't clear, but it's possible the employees accidentally downloaded malware onto the bank's computers. The criminals decided to hit on the afternoon of February 4th, after the banks in Bangladesh had closed for the day. This was a Thursday, and the weekend was starting on a Friday in that country, and it meant that the thieves had plenty of time before anybody realized what had happened. Requests were sent from the Bangladesh Bank to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Bangladesh Bank had an account at the U.S. Bank to maintain the country's foreign currency reserve. A total of 35 transaction requisitions were sent, with instructions to deposit money in various bank accounts around the world. One of these requests required the money to be sent to a Sri Lanka-based company named the Shizuka Foundation, but the word foundation was misspelled. That seemed strange to the bankers in New York, who flagged it as suspicious. 29 other requests were also flagged as suspicious, and they tried to contact their counterparts in Bangladesh. Because it was the weekend in Bangladesh, they received no response. 5 of the requests went through, sending money to Sri Lanka and the Philippines. When bankers returned to work on Sunday in Bangladesh, they realized what had happened. They couldn't contact the New York bank, as it was now the weekend there. It was also impossible to contact the banks in the Philippines, as the attack coincided with the New Year's celebrations in that country. The money that had been sent to the Sri Lanka account was recovered, but by the time the operatives in the Philippines started to act, the money had already been withdrawn. It was laundered through local casinos, and from that point onwards, it was impossible to trace. Roughly $1 billion was targeted during the attack, but most of the money was never sent after the New York banks stopped the request. In total, only roughly $81 million US was lost during the attack. The Bangladesh bank cyber heist was actually the 4th of its kind, using the SWIFT network to conduct the attack. The first had taken place 3 years earlier at the Sonali Bank of Bangladesh. In that case, keylogging software was installed on the bank's computers, allowing the criminals to get the codes they needed. $250,000 was stolen and sent to bank accounts in Turkey. The 2 other attacks targeted banks in Ecuador and Vietnam. It's not clear if any of these were connected, or if it was a different group of thieves using the same method. In the Bangladesh bank case, the criminals behind the plan were never identified. The FBI suspected that hackers working for the North Korean government may have been behind the attack, and may have been the same group behind the 2014 Sony attack. Linda McDaniel was a first-year elementary school teacher who was extremely dedicated to her job. So it was surprising to her coworkers when she didn't show up for work on December 1st, 1977. The reason for her absence was discovered when her aunt had checked her home and found Linda's lifeless body leaning over her bathtub, her face in a foot of water. Linda was 23 years old when she was attacked. Working in education ran in the family, with her aunt, mother, and sister all taking jobs at schools. But for Linda, it was more than just following the family's footsteps. She had a real passion for teaching and had studied to become an elementary school teacher. She'd worked as a substitute teacher after graduating from university and had recently gotten a classroom of her own. She was well liked by the children and her coworkers, and nobody expected anything horrifying to happen to her. When Linda didn't show up for work, her boss tried calling her apartment. When they didn't get a response, Linda's aunt was contacted. Linda's aunt also didn't get any response from her niece, so she went to check in on her. Her apartment was locked, and security had to let her in. In the apartment, nothing seemed out of place. At the table, there were crafting supplies, including Christmas ribbons, left out, but nothing else seemed out of place. Going room to room, Linda's aunt found that the bathroom door was locked. She managed to force her way in and finally found Linda. She was kneeling over the bathtub with her face in the water, her hands tied behind her back with the same Christmas ribbon. The crime shocked the local community, who couldn't believe someone would want to hurt such a well-loved young woman. Residents of the apartment complex complained about security, but the police believed that Linda had known the person who wanted to hurt her. The only problem in Linda's life was her love life. According to her sister, she'd always dreamed of getting married and having children, but hadn't found the right person to settle down with. She had a few boyfriends in the past, but it never worked out. At the time of the crime, she wasn't serious with anybody, but she'd recently been on a date. Linda confided in one of her friends that the man had tried to hurt her during the date. On the night before her body was found, Linda called the same friend to tell her the man was coming to visit. He wanted to apologize. Linda's friend warned her not to let him in the apartment, but Linda didn't believe anything bad would happen. Unfortunately, neither the friend nor any of Linda's other acquaintances knew the name of this individual. All of Linda's other boyfriends were investigated and eventually ruled out as suspects. The man Linda had gone on a date with was never identified, and the police couldn't be certain that he was the person responsible for the crime. Another potential suspect was a man Linda had worked with. Why he was considered a suspect isn't clear. but there was never enough evidence to tie him to the case. Even almost 50 years later, investigators are still working on this cold case. Evidence was collected from Linda's home, and it's possible DNA evidence could finally catch the criminal responsible. Fiction often inspires real-life crimes, and real-life crimes can go on to inspire fiction. The 1971 Baker Street heist fits both categories. Even though the main culprits in the case were found relatively quickly, mysteries still surround the famous heist. Some of these may not be solved for another 50 years. On the evening of Saturday, September 11th, an amateur radio enthusiast picked up some strange messages that were being sent via walkie-talkie. The enthusiast had just picked up the radio chatter of Anthony Gavin and his team, working on a heist that had been months in the making. Gavin was inspired by the Sherlock Holmes story, The Red-Headed League. In the story, a group of criminals tunnel into a bank from a nearby shop to break into the vault. Gavin believed the culprit's plan would have worked without the genius detective. He put together a group of criminals to break into the vault of Lloyd's Bank on Baker Street. The vault had all the best security, including alarms that would go off at the slightest tremor. Unfortunately, they were too sensitive, and roadworks in the area meant a number of false alarms, so the system was shut off. Another stroke of luck for them came when a leather shop 2 doors away from the bank went out of business. Benjamin Wolfe, one of Gavin's associates, was about to buy the lease, and it gave them the perfect place to start their dig. For weeks, the team dug from the leather shop beneath a fast food restaurant next door towards Lloyd's Bank. They planned for the final stage of their plan to take place over the weekend of September 11th, when the bank was closed. After attempting a few different methods to break through the vault walls, they had to settle on a substance known as blasting jelly, which flung dust up into the air. This prompted a discussion that the radio enthusiast picked up on. The radio enthusiast went to the police, who initially didn't believe him. When he returned with recordings, they agreed to check out the vaults of banks in the local area. After arriving at Lloyd's Bank, they found the vault doors sealed shut, with no sign that anything had changed since the bank closed on Friday. They went on to the next location, leaving the burglars to continue their work. When the bank opened on Monday morning, they found that countless safety deposit boxes had been ransacked. Somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million pounds were stolen. That would amount to between 9 and 54 million today. It didn't take the police long to figure out how the culprits had gotten into the vault, and then track down the new owner of the leather store. Wolfe claimed to not know about the crime and was released, but he led the police right to his associates. Just months after the crime, Gavin, Wolfe, and 2 others were all arrested and charged for the crime, but it's believed 4 members of the team managed to escape. Mickey Gervais was the alarm expert, and Bobby Mills acted as a lookout. Neither were caught. 2 others were never identified, known only as Little Legs and TH. Only a fraction of the money stolen was ever recovered, and for decades there have been rumors that there was some kind of cover-up. Some suspected that photographs were stolen from one of the safety deposit boxes that may have been compromising for the royal family. Other rumors claimed it was a matter of national security. While there's no evidence for any of these rumors, it's true that a strange decision was made to hide details of the case. Over 800 pages of information relating to the robbery are held by the National Archive and won't become public until 2071. Kidnappings are normally a horrifying and traumatic experience for the victims and for their families, even after the ordeal is over. The experience of banker John Gronthofer was not a normal kidnapping and has led to speculation decades after it took place. John was a successful businessman who had recently bought into the First Bank system to revamp the company and improve its standing. He did that by cutting jobs, tightening the rules on who could take out lines of credit, and reducing the overall expenses at the company. In the local press, it earned him the nickname Jack the Ripper, and hundreds of former employees were unhappy about his actions. John seemed to take the bad press in stride, but on November 19, 1990, he made headlines for a different reason. He arrived at the parking garage of his Minneapolis office at about 8:10 a.m. As soon as he got out of the car, he was confronted by a man who claimed to have a weapon. The man called himself Carl and tried to force John back into his car. As they struggled, a man named Jeff Rasmussen arrived at the scene. At first, he thought he had stumbled across a robbery, but as he approached, the two men stopped struggling and stood up. Carl said he had a weapon and told Jeff to leave. Jeff thought this was all a practical joke, but soon realized Carl was serious and fled the scene. John was forced into his car and made to drive out of the state. According to John, his kidnapper handcuffed dynamite to John's wrist and asked him questions about the company as they drove. He wanted to know who would be in charge if John went missing, and seemed to have a lot of knowledge about the First Bank system. At this point, it would have been impossible to know if the kidnapper was motivated by money or the possibility of removing John from the business. Just before 9 a.m., that question seemed to be answered when he made John call his secretary and request a ransom of $3 million. As employees began to get the ransom ready, the kidnapper realized he'd made a mistake. In the parking garage, he had a sheet of paper with instructions on how to commit the crime. During the scuffle, he had dropped the cheat sheet, and only now had he realized. A passerby had spotted the cheat sheet and handed it to the police before the ransom request even came through. Without the paper, the kidnapper panicked. He took John to a secluded spot in Wisconsin, tied him up, and forced him into a sleeping bag waiting there. Then he ran, taking John's car to make his escape. After about 20 minutes, John realized he was alone and made his escape. He found his way to a nearby farmhouse and contacted the authorities. The terrifying ordeal was over, and within hours, John was at a press conference saying that he was going to focus on running the bank. But he did help the police with their investigations. He gave a description of the kidnapper as a 6'2" middle-aged man, weighing 250 pounds with thick yellow-tinted glasses. A sketch was made, and a number of people contacted authorities to say it resembled a man named John Henderson. Even Grundhofer identified Henderson as the kidnapper. The police found no connection between Henderson and the case, though, and he was eventually released. Recently, some have suspected that John orchestrated the entire ordeal to gain sympathy from the press. Whoever his kidnapper was clearly an amateur, but he managed to get away without ever being caught. Some suspect John may have been protecting him, but John never had a problem with negative press before or after, and there's no evidence this was all a hoax. John would pass away in 2021 at the age of 82, and the case remains unsolved. Sandy Drummond was seemingly an ordinary man living in Scotland and working at a paper mill. On June 24, 1991, his body was found on a path near his home. At first, it looked as if he'd passed from natural causes. A deeper look at the remains and Sandy's life just before the incident revealed that there was much more to this. Medical examination of Sandy's remains discovered that he'd been struck by what was described as a jiu-jitsu-style hit on the back of his head, which caused him to suffocate. But other than a few bruises, his passing had been quick and pain-free. That alone would be strange enough, but Sandy's actions in the weeks before his passing also indicated that something strange was going on. Sandy had previously been in the military, serving in Northern Ireland, but had left years earlier. For the past 7 years, he'd worked at the local paper mill and lived in a cottage with his brother. His family described him as gentle, intelligent, and shy around new people. But a few months before the incident, things seemed to change. His family noticed that he seemed to be sad and withdrawn. More interestingly, he'd asked for a job transfer at the company where he worked. No reason for this was ever given. Weeks before his passing, he abruptly quit his job and refused to work his notice. There was obviously something going on in Sandy's life that his family didn't know about. When his mother asked, he told her that he couldn't reveal the secret as it was too filthy. The day before the incident, he told his mother he was thinking of going on a trip on his motorcycle for a break. When Sandy left that evening, there was nothing to suggest to his mother that this was the last time she would see him alive. The last time anybody saw Sandy was the morning of the incident. After his brother left for work, neighbors spotted Sandy rushing out of the house carrying a blue sports bag. He was later spotted at a nearby ATM, withdrawing nearly all the money from his savings account. What happened after that is a mystery. It was at 8 p.m. that evening that his body was discovered. neither the blue bag nor the money was found on Sandy's person. Investigators later discovered the money at his home, suggesting that he had made it back to the cottage before the attack. It also seemed to indicate that theft hadn't been the motive for the attack. That left the motive a mystery. There didn't seem to be any reason why anybody would want to hurt Sandy, except possibly the mysterious secret that he had. It's possible he knew too much about something and had been taken out before he could reveal it to anybody. Some believed he may have been blackmailed, but if this were the case, it wouldn't explain why the money was found. Unfortunately, Sandy's case quickly went cold. His mother passed away without ever finding out who had hurt her son. Investigators believe it's unlikely the case will ever be solved unless someone comes forward with information. When staff at the Hollywood First Interstate Bank arrived at work on June 9, 1986, there didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary. That was until they opened the vault and discovered a hole in the floor and the contents of dozens of safety deposit boxes ransacked. They'd been hit by a gang that would become known as the Burrowing Burglars. Police investigations discovered a tunnel that had been built from the bank to a nearby drain system. Beneath the streets of Los Angeles are a series of storm drains, big enough for all-terrain vehicles to travel through. The criminals apparently had intimate knowledge of the geography of these storm drains and knew just where to start their tunnel to get to the bank on the corner of Spalding Avenue and Sunset Boulevard. They had dug roughly 95 feet to the vault of the bank. The tunnel was dug mostly by hand and finished off by electric tools. Investigators believed it would have taken weeks, if not months, to work, and the criminals had used the flow of water to dispose of the dirt that they had excavated. In the lead up to the theft, a few strange occurrences had been noted, including the alarm system inside the vault going off for no reason. One manager working late at night reported hearing the sound of scratching coming from the walls, but believed it was probably just a rat. It turned out that these were actually early warnings about the break-in. The thieves left behind empty styrofoam coffee cups and a few tools, but no other clues that could pinpoint their identity. They had taken about $172,000 in cash, as well as the contents of safety deposit boxes. The total value of their haul was closer to $2 million. Police spent months investigating the case, but it soon went cold. There had been no new developments when, over a month later, the Burrowing Burglars struck again. This time, the target was the Bank of America in West Los Angeles. The alarm went off on August 22, 1987, and the police and the bank staff rushed to the scene. The vault was opened, and the police discovered another hole in the floor. This time, it looked as if the criminals had fled mid-robbery, leaving behind valuable tools. They took less than $100,000. A search of the surrounding storm drains revealed a second tunnel, this time leading to a Beverly Hills bank. It was believed that the criminals had wanted to hit both banks on the same weekend. If it had gone off, investigators believed it would have been the crime of the century. Because they had been disturbed, there was a little more evidence for the police to work with this time. A diamond-tipped cutting tool was discovered at the scene. It was traced to a dealer in the San Francisco Bay region who sold it to people claiming to be from a company in San Diego. The company and the address the men gave were both false. The police also discovered one of the vehicles they used to get away. This was also investigated, and the dealer was located, and it had been bought by somebody by the name of Robert Spalding. Sales associates were able to give a description of the individual, and police sketches were made. The man was white, in his early 30s, and roughly 6 feet tall. Nobody ever got caught for the crime, as the statute of limitations ran out in 1992. The culprits managed to get away with the theft. Their identities remain a mystery. In 1965, police officers responding to a wellness check in Houston made a horrifying discovery in the refrigerator of an elderly couple. More than 50 years on, the only witness and suspect in the case is still missing. Fred and Edwina Rogers lived in the Montrose neighborhood of Houston. The couple also lived with their adult son, Charles. This wasn't something their neighbors knew. Charles was a recluse who left early in the morning and returned late at night. He only communicated with his parents through notes. Charles seemed to be a relatively successful young man. He'd served in the U.S. Navy during World War II and had a degree in nuclear physics. After leaving the military, he worked as a seismologist for an oil company and was very talented at his job. He was intelligent, spoke multiple languages, and had an interest in ham radio. But by June of 1965, it seemed as if Charles was unemployed. It was Charles's cousin who alerted authorities that something was wrong. He usually spoke with his aunt on the phone, but none of his calls had been answered for a few days. He didn't live in the area, so asked the local police to conduct a wellness check. They also didn't get a response when knocking on the door. At the back of the house, they found what seemed to be a barricade of flower pots, which was the first sign that something very wrong was going on. The two police officers made their way into the house. They noted food on the dining table, and nothing seemed to be out of place. One checked the refrigerator and found the remains of Fred and Edwina. Both had been violently attacked before their remains were washed and stored. Parts of Fred's remains were also found in the house's sewer system. Most of the rest of the house was spotless, as if someone had purposefully cleaned it to get rid of any evidence. What little bodily fluids were found led to Charles's room. There was no sign of Charles in the house. At first, the police believed he may have been a witness to the crime, but they soon realized that it was likely he was the person responsible. Investigators believed that Fred and Edwina had been manipulating and harming Charles for years. They were described as con artists who had stolen his life savings and taken out loans in his name. This was the motive that fueled the crime. 3 days before the bodies were found on Father's Day, Charles snapped and took his parents' lives before fleeing the scene. It's speculated that he may have fled to Mexico, with some believing that his connections through his work and hobbies allowed him to get a job at a mine in Latin America. There are a few pieces of the case that don't seem to make much sense. It seems strange to clean the entire house, removing valuable evidence that could help crack the case for certain, but leave behind the bodies in an obvious place. If Charles were the person behind the crime, it would suggest he wasn't necessarily trying to hide this fact before he ran. 10 years after his disappearance, Charles was declared as having passed away. Even though the case has gone cold since Charles's disappearance, that hasn't stopped new investigations from taking place, as more investigators try to get to the bottom of what happened in this strange and disturbing case. In October of 2000, two women in Houston, Texas, had their lives violently taken within days of one another. Both were roughly the same age, had similar features, the same first and last names, and police believe the two cases aren't connected, but many disagree. The first victim was a bank loan officer named Mary Lou Morris. She was last seen alive by her husband on the morning of October 12th. She left to head to work but never made it into the office. Throughout the day, both her husband and her boss tried to call her, but Mary never answered. That evening, she was reported missing. At the same time, the police were informed of a smoldering car on the side of the road, not far from Mary Lou's home. The car had been burning since that morning and was completely wrecked by the time police arrived. There was a body in the driver's seat, but it was beyond recognition. It was only through analysis of a tooth that the police were able to confirm this was the body of Mary Lou Morris. Mary's friends and family were shocked by the crime. She had no known enemies and seemed to get along with everybody she met. Nobody could think of any reason why someone would do something like this. Such a scary crime interested the local papers. It was only made more interesting the day after the crime when someone called the Houston Chronicle and told them that, quote, they had gotten the wrong Mary Morris. 4 days after Mary Lou Morris lost her life, the police were called to another burning car. Again, there was a body in the driver's seat, and again, it belonged to Mary Morris. This time, the victim was Mary McGinnis Morris, a successful nurse practitioner, and she'd been attacked with a blunt object and not a bullet wound. The weapon matched one that her husband had bought her for protection and was kept under the driver's seat of her car. Mary McGinnis was also a well-liked woman, but she did have a few enemies. One was a male nurse who she'd worked with. Mary had told friends that she felt threatened by this individual and believed he could hurt her. Shortly before the attack, someone had left a threatening note on her desk, which she believed was from her coworker. On the night of the attack, she had called the same friend, telling her that she felt threatened by someone at the hospital store. She said she was going to run back to her office, turn off her computer, and go home. 12 minutes after she hung up, she made a call to 911. The call took place during the attack, and those who have heard it described it as a chilling, disturbing call. Mary's co-worker isn't the only suspect in her case. She'd been having marital problems, and her husband Mike was accused of hiring someone to take out his wife. Evidence for this was a call to Mary, which occurred after she had already passed. The call lasted 4 minutes, and phone records showed it had been picked up. Investigators believe it may have been to the person responsible. Mike has always denied any involvement in the case, as has Mary's co-worker. The police believe that the two crimes were just a chilling coincidence, and no suspect has ever been identified in Mary Lou's case. In the 1880s, London was shaken by an uncatchable criminal who was taking the lives of some of the most vulnerable women in society. The Metropolitan Police were dedicated to trying to catch the infamous Jack the Ripper, who took the lives of at least 5 women. But the focus on Jack the Ripper allowed another more mysterious criminal to escape justice. Between 1887 and 1889, the bodies of 4 women were pulled from the River Thames in various locations inland. Collectively, they were known as the Thames Torso Murders or the Thames Mysteries. Police at the time, and investigators today, recognized them as a distinct series of crimes, separate from the Ripper cases. The series started in May of 1887 in Raynham, roughly 13.6 miles from central London. Workers spotted a strange bundle floating in the River Thames and pulled it out of the water, and the bundle contained the torso of a woman. Over the following weeks, more body parts were found in the surrounding area. Eventually, an entire body, with the exception of the head and upper chest, was located and carefully pieced together. Doctors couldn't figure out how she had passed away. A jury wasn't even able to determine for certain if she'd been the victim of foul play. The woman was never identified, and it wasn't long before her case went cold. Only a few months later, the Jack the Ripper crimes began, and the focus turned to this new criminal who became the focus of press attention. 2 of the canonical 5 Jack the Ripper victims had already had their lives taken when the Thames Mysteries resumed. This time, the criminal was even more audacious. On September 11, 1888, the arm of a woman was found in Thames in the Pimlico neighborhood. As in the first case, more body parts would be found over the following days, and this time the woman's torso was located on the grounds of the construction site for the new Scotland Yard building, where London's police force would soon be based. The disposal location could also seem as if it was taunting the police, but unlike the Ripper, the Thames criminal never wrote to the press or the police, flaunting his crimes. Also unlike the Ripper, there was another considerable delay before his 3rd victim was attacked. It was June of 1889 when the torso of the Thames' 3rd victim was located. Local newspapers diligently reported each day as new body parts were found. This time, a scar on the victim's wrist and vaccination marks on her arm allowed the police to identify the victim as Elizabeth Jackson. Elizabeth was a street worker from Chelsea. At first, the police suspected her ex-boyfriend, who'd been violent towards her in the past. But the man had been away from London for almost 2 weeks before the crime and was eventually ruled out as a suspect. The final canonical victim in the Thames series was located first under a railway arch in Whitechapel, and she couldn't be identified. In each case, doctors determined that the criminal had used some degree of medical knowledge. It might have been guessed that the criminal was a doctor or a medical student. In the days before X-rays, the only way to learn about the interior of the body was by examining people who had passed away. Most of the time, these were people who had donated their bodies to science or whose remains had been stolen. But it wouldn't be too surprising to learn someone had their lives taken from them to examine their bodies. But examinations of the remains determined that the women hadn't been attacked for medical dissection. The criminal had good knowledge of the joints in the human body, but that wasn't the motive for the attacks. A few other cases in the years before and after the attacks have also been associated with the Thames series, but they haven't been confirmed. Suspects in the case range from doctors to butchers to people who worked on the River Thames itself. It seemed as if the criminal was using the Thames to dispose of his victims away from the crime scene. It may have also been where he found his victims. Over 130 years since the attacks, and the Thames mystery remains unsolved, often overlooked in history. it seems unlikely this case will ever be solved. On the night of January 21st, 1984, a man named MJ Chaco was trying to make it home to his pregnant wife to celebrate their wedding anniversary the following day. He accepted a lift with a group of men that he didn't know and became a victim of a disturbing crime that would make the mastermind infamous all throughout India. Chaco worked in the movie industry, traveling to cinemas to sell them reels and convince them to screen films for extended periods. On the night of the crime, he was in the village of Karuvada to talk to a cinema owner. By the time his business was finished, it was late into the evening and public transport back to town wasn't running. The owner's son, a man named Sukumar, tried to convince Chaco to stay the night with him, but Chaco was determined to return home. He managed to get a lift in an ambassador car and was never seen alive again. A few days later, Sukumar went to visit Chaco's family, as he hadn't heard from him since the meeting, but they also hadn't seen him. They didn't think it was anything out of the ordinary, as Chaco always had to travel for work, but Sukumar convinced them to go to the police about his disappearance. When Chaco's wife arrived at the police station, the police were already investigating a horrific crime. On the same night Chaco had gone missing, someone had apparently taken the life of Sukumar Kurup in a violent fashion. Kurup was from a wealthy family with good connections politically. He'd immigrated to Abu Dhabi years earlier with his wife, a nurse, and became an executive at an oil company. He would occasionally return to India, often staying with his wife's family. On the morning of January 22nd, his car was found on fire in a paddy field in a scenic village about 30 minutes away from Karuvada. Inside the car, they found the badly damaged remains of a man that matched Kurup's general appearance. The police also located a partially burned glove and a sandal outside the car. The police found the reaction of Kurup's family suspicious. At first, his brother-in-law, Bhaskara Pillai, claimed that Kurup had enemies in the Middle East, who may want to hurt him, but the burn marks on Pillai's arm showed that he may have been involved in the fire. The next person to reveal information was Kurup's driver, Ponnappan. He claimed that the two had been driving when he accidentally hit someone. They started the fire to cover up the passing. The body was exhumed and identified as Chaco. Slowly, more and more people were implicated in the crime, and eventually the truth came out. Kurup had wanted to fake his passing for the insurance money, and acquired the help of 3 men to do it, as well as Pillai and Ponnappan. An attendee at Kurup's company named Chinakal Shahu was also involved. The other 3 men drove around in Kurup's car on the night of January 21st, looking for someone who looked similar enough to Kurup. Kurup himself followed behind in another car. They came across Chaco, who matched the description they were looking for. They offered him a lift, then took his life in the back of the car. After removing any identifying jewelry, they took the car to the paddy field and set it alight. Pillai got some fuel on him, accidentally burning himself and leaving behind clues that would reveal the conspiracy. Kurup's associates were all arrested. Pillai and Ponnappan were sentenced to life in prison, while Shahu became an approver and gave evidence for the prosecution. Kurup was nowhere to be found. The police followed his trail for a while, and there were narrow escapes where he just managed to get away before they arrived. The trail would go cold though, and he remains one of India's most wanted criminals. Chaco's wife and son, who never met his father, still hope that he may be caught and one day face justice. While we may read and hear a lot about the lives of celebrities, there are many mysteries involving famous people that have never been solved. It may seem strange that a case relating to a well-known person could drag on for decades, but in many instances, details of the event are covered up, or evidence is found to be lacking, and the investigation goes cold forever. Number 10. It's said that the mystery surrounding the passing of 30-year-old silent film star Virginia Rappe was the first ever scandal to rock Hollywood, and it's one that remains unsolved to this day. Despite the fact that many people believe another actor was responsible for ending her life. In 1921, Virginia was a model and actress with a promising career. She had appeared in 13 movies, one of which starred one of the silent film era's most famous stars, Roscoe Arbuckle, also known by the nickname Fatty. Arbuckle, on the contrary, had appeared in more than 100 silent films, a few of which starred the famous Charlie Chaplin. He was already well known to audiences and was considered somewhat of a national treasure. But on the 9th of September 1921, everything was about to change for both of these actors. It was Labor Day, and film director Fred Fischbach was throwing a party in San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel that was being held in 3 adjoining rooms. Most of the attendees were working in the movie industry, and among the invited guests were Virginia and Arbuckle. The party lasted an astonishing 3 days, with a lot of liquor to be had, despite the fact that this was during the Prohibition era. One of the other guests at the party, a woman named Maud Delmont, later told detectives that she saw both Virginia and Arbuckle consume a fair amount of alcohol, and that at one point during the 3 days, she heard him say that he'd been waiting for Virginia for 5 years, and now he finally had her. They then left the party and went to one of the bedrooms together, but just a few minutes later, guests at the party heard Virginia screaming in pain, and they rushed to the room to see what had happened. When they entered the room, they found her on the bed, fully clothed, but writhing in agony. The first thing she said was that Arbuckle had done something to her, but Arbuckle claimed that she had fallen off the bed and somehow hurt herself. When a doctor was called, he guessed that Virginia had simply had too much to drink, and he gave her some medication to help her sleep. But 3 days later, she had to be rushed to a hospital as her condition only worsened, and the next day she passed away from complications stemming from a ruptured bladder. People speculated that Arbuckle had assaulted her, and at one point, his immense weight had caused her to suffer internal injuries. After an investigation, he was taken into custody. This had a severe effect on his career since all of his movies were removed from movie theaters, and other actors started speaking out against him, with one describing him as a vulgarian from the gutter. When the trial started, it was clear that the prosecution would have a tough time proving that Arbuckle was the culprit, since most of the witnesses had been drinking. For example, Maud Delmont had had between 8 and 10 whiskeys when the event occurred. Arbuckle stated that he was merely taking care of Virginia, who was feeling ill at the party, and that he had in no way assaulted her. Thanks to a lack of evidence, his charge was downgraded to manslaughter, and his films were once again being screened in theaters. In the end, he was found guilty of illegal drinking and nothing else. No one else has ever been accused of a crime, and to this day we have no idea what really happened in that hotel room on that night decades ago. Number 9. In 2007, 36-year-old Tony Harris, a talented former Washington State basketball player who played in several countries including Brazil and countries in Asia as well as Europe, was starting to act out of character. According to his friends, he'd become paranoid, and they were concerned for his mental well-being. Tony had returned to Brazil that year after working as a counselor in Seattle for a while. But when he got the opportunity to play for the Universo BRB basketball team in Brazil, he decided that it was time to focus on the game once more. His wife later told investigators that she last heard from him on the 4th of November that year, when he told her that he was trying to catch a cab. His teammates had, in the meantime, started noticing his strange behavior, and they got wind that he was in Becerra, where he was seen asking people for money. His mother-in-law reported that he'd emailed her during this time, stating that he was growing increasingly worried that he was being watched. He explained that whenever he entered a room, everyone would stop talking, and he was now just about certain that someone was going to try and harm him. He told his wife that he could sometimes hear his teammates whispering about him while they were in the locker room. He thought he heard them asking about him having an affair, which wasn't true, and that he'd left the US because he had contracted a disease. At one point, he even went as far as to bring the negative results of a test for the disease to the locker room to prove that that wasn't the case, but his teammates seemed confused when he showed it to them, leaving Tony baffled. One night, he spoke to his wife over the phone, and his demeanor scared her, since he sounded as though he was making his final arrangements, saying things like, "Tell my son I love him, that I'm proud of him, and that he needs to finish school." His paranoia started to badly affect his playing, and after every game he would rush back to the safety of his hotel room. On the 2nd of November, he emailed his wife saying that he couldn't figure out why he was being so paranoid, and that he believed someone had been in his room since the TV's volume has been changed while he was out, though this was likely done by a room service staff member. The following day, he played another game and asked one of his teammates, Esteban Ferreira, to give him a ride to the hotel. Once there, he invited Ferreira up to the room where he immediately started packing up his belongings, to Ferreira's confusion. He stated that he wanted to go home, and that he was only taking the essentials with him. He confessed to his teammate that he was terrified while they were driving to the airport. Once there, he planned to see a friend in Natal, but realized that he had left his passport with a team member. Ferreira then drove Tony to a bus terminal where he got on a coach and traveled to Becerra. There, he was seen begging for food and money and walking the streets a few times over the following days, but on the 18th of November, he was found deceased near a fishing hole in a wooded area. No one was ever able to figure out why Tony had become so paranoid, or who he believed was after him, and his passing is one that may remain unsolved for a very long time to come. Number 8. Another mystery that occurred during the Prohibition era is the strange passing of 49-year-old William Desmond Taylor, who was a famous movie director in the 1920s. Alcohol was illegal in Los Angeles at the time, but nevertheless, on the 21st of February, 1922, Taylor and Mabel Normand, a silent film actress, were in his apartment enjoying a few cocktails. At around 7:45, Normand decided it was time for her to go home, and Taylor walked her to her chauffeur-driven car. They said goodnight and Normand left, leaving Taylor to walk back to his apartment. But in the next few seconds, his neighbors heard a sound that they described as something similar to a car backfiring. One of the neighbors, Faith McLean, went to her window to see what had happened, and she later told investigators that she saw a suspicious man wearing a long coat and a plaid cap standing in Taylor's driveway. He glanced at her, turned, and walked into Taylor's apartment. This is when McLean noticed that the man had a slightly effeminate walk, and she would later admit that the person she saw may have been a woman. One of Taylor's other neighbors, Hazel Gillen, also saw this person but was unable to describe them. The neighbors thought nothing more of it, and nothing more was done until 7:30 the next morning, when Henry Peavy, Taylor's houseman, arrived at the apartment and found Taylor deceased in his living room. Bizarrely, the first call that Peavy made was to Famous Players, later known as Paramount Pictures, and representatives arrived on the scene long before the authorities did. They removed several letters from the property, along with illegal alcohol that was in the apartment, and told Peavy to clean the crime scene as there was a lot of biological material on the floor where Taylor was discovered. When the police were finally called, a lot of evidence had either been removed or compromised. One of the first suspects to emerge was Mary Miles Minter, an actress who'd publicly professed to be in love with Taylor, but whose advances had always been rejected. When she was questioned, she stated that she hadn't seen Taylor for quite some time, but it was then found that she had been in his apartment on the day that the crime was committed. Furthermore, 3 blonde hairs, thought to belong to Minter, were found on Taylor's pants. It was speculated that Minter arrived at Taylor's apartment that night and threatened to cause a scene if he were to reject her again. Investigators say that he then hugged her to calm her down, but that the firearm then accidentally discharged and ended his life. It was also believed that the firearm belonged to Minter's mother, Charlotte Shelby, but neither was ever arrested, likely because they were close friends with District Attorney Thomas Lee Woolwine, who was later accused of accepting bribes. Furthermore, police officers would later report that when they started making inroads into the case, they were either told to stop looking into the matter or to investigate a different avenue of inquiry. Some people suggested that Shelby disguised herself as a man that night and snuck into Taylor's apartment looking for Minter. Known to be an obsessive mother, Shelby found her daughter there, lost her temper, and fired at Taylor, ending his life, though this was never proven. Number 7. On the 22nd of November, 1963, many people's lives in the US were changed forever when they learned that the then president of the country, John F. Kennedy, had been assassinated. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the crime, but many people felt that something was amiss and that there was more to the story than meets the eye. This sentiment was shared by Dorothy Kilgallen, a reporter who became well known in the country after she published a piece in which she detailed Frank Sinatra's involvement with organized crime. She was clearly not one to be intimidated or silenced, and so it's fair to say that her investigation into Kennedy's assassination didn't sit well with a lot of influential people. She held interviews with people who were present when it occurred, and also questioned Jack Ruby, the man who ended Lee Harvey Oswald's life. She grew ever more suspicious that the case was not at all what it seemed, and voiced her opinion that Oswald should have received a fair trial, but was denied this by a man who was thought to be connected to organized crime, and who was allowed to simply walk into the Dallas Police Department to end Harvey's life in full view of several officers. It was later discovered that she had planned to meet with an informant who claimed to know the truth about the assassination but never got the chance. She also noted that Police Chief Jesse Curry had made conflicting statements about the incident. He claimed to have heard shots ring out from the school book depository, but copies of police communications showed that he ordered his men to run to an overpass where several people were seen standing. He was also the one who allowed Jack Ruby access to the police station before attacking Oswald. Kilgallen also learned that Oswald had met with Ruby, Bernard Wiseman from the John Birch Society, police officer J.D. Tippett, and an unknown man at the Carousel Club 8 days before the assassination, though it isn't known what that meeting was about. Furthermore, she claimed that the police had checked a certain firearm found in the book depository into evidence, and then later swapped it out for Oswald's weapon. Soon, she started to worry that the FBI had tapped her phone, and that she was being investigated. Nevertheless, she was determined to make her findings public, but on the 8th of November, 1965, she was found deceased in her house in New York, reportedly having lost her life to alcohol and illegal substances. The coroner was unable to state whether it was an accident, but her passing left many people feeling suspicious, given the case that she'd been working on and the information that she was planning to take public. Strangely, most of Kilgallen's notes on her investigation suddenly disappeared after her passing and were never found again. Number 6. Suad Hosny, a 58-year-old Egyptian actress, was known by her fans as the Cinderella of the screen, thanks to her beauty and acting talents. She'd become one of the most famous and most influential actresses in the Middle East, having appeared in more than 90 movies in her long and prosperous career. Suad was born in Cairo, Egypt in 1943 as one of 15 children. Her family embraced their artistic side, as her sister was also a well-known actress and singer, while her father worked as a calligrapher. She made her singing debut on a radio show when she was just 3 years old, and when she turned 16, she landed her first role in a movie adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. She quickly made an impression in the movie industry and was hailed for having pure, raw talent. She'd been married several times in her life, first to a director, but that marriage only lasted 2 years. She then married a different director, and this time they remained together for 11 years. Her next marriage fell apart after just a few months, and last she married a scriptwriter named Maher Awad, who was her husband until her untimely passing in June of 2001 in Westminster, London. There were rumors that she was once married to singer Abdel Hafez, though this has never been confirmed, despite some of her friends reporting that they had once grown close but never married. While she could easily have been typecast as a romantic film actress, she refused to let this happen and starred in films in many different genres, including political films that addressed tough issues such as poverty and gender inequality. She last appeared in a film called The Shepherd and the Woman, which was released in 1991. In 1979, though, she was busy working on a film called The Fierce, in which she played the role of a circus acrobat. During filming, she had an unfortunate slip that caused an injury to her back, and she would receive treatment for it indefinitely. It had an adverse effect on her career, and for a while she withdrew from the film industry and the spotlight. In 1992, she relocated to Paris, France, where she underwent surgery, but this did little to ease her discomfort, and her health started to decline. She then moved to London, where she sought out further treatment and never returned, choosing instead to start a new life in England. 4 years later, though, tragedy struck while Suad was visiting a friend, Nadia Yousri, at her Stuart Tower apartment in Westminster. At some point, she was out on the apartment's balcony when she fell 6 floors to the street below, instantly losing her life. The news of her passing came as a shock to everyone who knew her, and understandably they wanted to know what had happened. But try as they might, they were unable to learn any details of the incident, as the authorities refused to divulge any information. And to this day, her passing is shrouded in mystery, with no further details ever having been released. Number 5. In the 1950s, Lana Turner had made a name for herself in the film industry, not only thanks to her acting talents, but thanks in part to her beauty. She was known to play parts in which she played a good girl gone bad. It's rumored that she was discovered by a Hollywood film journalist while they were in the same pharmacy, leading to her first role in a film called They Won't Forget. Following that, she landed roles in several romantic dramas, and in 1946, she starred in the well-known movie The Postman Always Rings Twice. She landed several more roles after that, but is also remembered for appearing in the soap opera Falcon Crest. Her own romantic life, though, was rather unstable. She was married 8 times, twice to actor and restaurateur Stephen Crane. But in 1957, she was working on a film called The Lady Takes a Flyer, when she started receiving flowers and phone calls from a man called John Steele. It was later revealed that Steele was actually a gangster called Johnny Stompanato, who'd been infatuated with her for years, and when she confronted him, he stated that he used a pseudonym because he was afraid that she wouldn't have anything to do with him if she found out who he really was. Turner had her doubts about Stompanato, but decided to enter a relationship with him anyway, since she'd just gotten divorced from her 5th husband. Stompanato soon started reaping the benefits of the relationship, since Turner was paying his gambling debts and living expenses, something that did not sit well with her 14-year-old daughter. Soon, the relationship started to sour when Stompanato began assaulting Turner. They often had arguments that turned violent, and on more than one occasion, Stompanato threatened even more violence on her and her daughter if he didn't get his way. Less than a year after meeting him, Turner decided that she wanted out of the relationship, and when she traveled to England with Sean Connery to film the movie Another Time, Another Place, she took the opportunity to inform Stompanato of her feelings. But the gangster refused to accept her rejection and started accusing her of having an affair with Connery. He flew to England to confront her, but she refused to see him. But this prompted him to barge through security on the film set, after which he produced a firearm and pointed it at Connery. But Connery sprang into action, twisted the weapon out of his hand, and landed a hard punch to his face, prompting Stompanato to run away. He was eventually detained and deported back to the US. The following year, Turner was to attend the 1958 Academy Awards, and when Stompanato found out that she would not be asking him to accompany him, she was outraged. She told her daughter that she would be ending the relationship for good on the 4th of April that year, and when he arrived at her house that night, she did just that. He flew into a rage and started threatening Turner once again, but the conversation was overheard by her daughter, who was upstairs in her bedroom. Fearing for her mother's safety, she ran into the kitchen, grabbed a sharpened blade and attacked him after mistakenly thinking he had a firearm raised at her mother. At her trial, Turner's daughter was found not guilty of murder, and she would eventually decide to go live with their father, Stephen Crane. But many people believe that it was actually Turner who ended Stompanato's life, and that she was coached by attorney Jerry Geisler to say that her daughter was responsible, since she would be more likely to get away with it. No one knows for certain who yielded the blade that night, and since the investigation has been closed for decades, it's unlikely the case will ever be reopened. Number 4. 24-year-old Chris Trickle is remembered by fans as a very talented NASCAR driver who lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. He was the son of another NASCAR driver, Dick Trickle, who had won more than 1,200 feature races in his career. Chris was a talented racer from a young age, though he preferred riding motorbikes when he was just 8 years old. When he turned 18, he started focusing on stock car races and was named Rookie of the Year in late models just 2 years later. In 1993, he racked up 10 total wins, followed by another 8 the next year. He exceeded this accomplishment in 1995 by winning 16 races and ending in the top 10 a further 12 times, leaving no doubt that he was a very talented driver. 1996 was a little less successful, as he only won 1 race, but he also tried to qualify for the Craftsman Truck Series but failed at both attempts. He became known around the world when he competed in NASCAR Winter Heat Series that was broadcast on ESPN2, and was slated to join the Craftsman Truck Series the following year, but his life was tragically cut short before he had the chance to do so. On the 9th of February, 1997, Trickle was living with his girlfriend, Jennifer Robinson, in a 1-bedroom apartment at his parents' house. He'd made plans to play a game of tennis with one of his friends, Greg Hadges, and set out at around 9 p.m., but he never made it there. About 10 minutes after leaving the apartment, he drove onto Blue Diamond Road where a car started driving alongside his. Moments later, the occupants of this car opened fire on Trickle's vehicle, and he was struck in the head. He was rushed to the hospital but fell into a coma. He briefly emerged from the coma in October of that year but quickly fell back into it again. He contracted pneumonia but survived and had to undergo as many as 5 major surgeries since he'd sustained serious brain damage. But on the 25th of March, 1998, he passed away from the injuries caused by the attack. Strangely, no witnesses came forward to identify the car that had fired at him, and conspiracy theories began to emerge. Soon, people speculated that it was a targeted attack, though no one could find any reason why someone would want to end Trickle's life, as he had no enemies and was well liked by those who knew him. Others speculated that it was a crime of opportunity, and that his life had been ended by someone who was looking for a thrill. This is the most widely accepted theory, since no suspects were ever named during the resulting investigation. Then there's the theory that he'd gotten involved in a road rage incident, during which the driver of the other vehicle lost their temper and decided to fire at Trickle's car. If this was indeed the case, that person has never been identified, and it's very unlikely that they'll ever come forward. Trickle's family offered a $35,000 reward to anyone who came forward with information, leading to the case being solved. But no one ever did, and the case has since been closed, since it passed the statute of limitations and will therefore never be solved. Number 3. Jack Nance, the actor best remembered for playing the role of Henry Spencer in the David Lynch horror film Eraserhead, had by all accounts a difficult adult life. When he was still a child, he was struck by a car, which caused him to suffer a back injury. But when he graduated from university, he started focusing on an acting career. In 1964, he relocated to California and joined the American Conservatory Theater, which is based in San Francisco, where he saw some success under the direction of David Lindemann. In 1972, he met director David Lynch after Lindemann recommended him for the Henry Spencer role in Eraserhead. The project would take 5 years to complete and initially wasn't well received, but it soon became a cult classic, and Nance became a well-known face among horror movie buffs. His performance also had an impact on director Stanley Kubrick, who insisted that the cast of the movie The Shining watch Eraserhead before they started filming. Nance became one of Lynch's go-to actors, and he appeared in many more of his movies, including Dune, Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me, and Lost Highway, among others. But he was fighting a few of his own personal demons. Up until 1986, Nance had struggled with alcoholism, but that year he decided to make a change and managed to kick the habit. He started working in the hospitality industry to make a decent wage and landed a job as a clerk at Hotel Hollywood. But he appeared in a few more films such as The Blob and Colors. But in 1993, he relapsed into his old habits following the passing of his wife, Kelly Jean Van Dyke. He had started drinking again and was eventually asked to leave his accommodation at the hotel after he discharged a firearm at his TV. He suffered strokes in 1995 and 1996, and in 1997 he was removed from the set of the movie Joyride after just 1 day of filming because he was found to be extremely intoxicated. Then, on the 29th of December, 1996, Nance was having lunch with 2 of his friends who noticed that he had a black eye. When they asked him about it, he told them that he'd gone to a Winchell's Donut House at 5 a.m. that morning, and that he was walking in the store's parking lot and passed 2 Hispanic men. And as he was known to do, he made a snide remark in their direction. One of the men retaliated by punching him, and considering he was now 53 years old, it did more damage than he realized. He went home after the lunch meeting complaining of a headache. Nance's account of what had happened has been disputed though, since Leo Bulgarini, the screenwriter who had joined him for lunch, went to the donut shop to ask if anyone had seen the altercation, but no one had, and Bulgarini doubted if the story was true. The next morning, Bulgarini went to Nance's apartment to help him do his laundry, but when he arrived, he found the actor deceased in his bathroom. A coroner found that he'd passed away due to a subdural hematoma that was caused by blunt force trauma, and the case was handled as a homicide investigation. Though some people believe he slipped in his bathroom and banged his head, others believe his story and hope that the culprit would be caught one day to face the long arm of the law. But this never happened, and Nance's case has never been solved. Number 2. In 2010, 64-year-old Ronni Chasen had paved a career for herself as a famous publicist who had worked with some of the biggest names in the entertainment industry. She was very familiar with Hollywood premieres, having attended many throughout her career, and the night of the 16th of November, 2016 was no exception. She had attended the premiere of the film Burlesque and left the venue at around midnight that night, but would lose her life before she made it home. Reports on the incident state that she'd made a left turn at the Sunset Boulevard and Whittier Drive intersection when she was attacked with a firearm. She was found in her car about 30 minutes after leaving the premiere, and it was determined that she'd been hit 4 times and unfortunately later passed away. Investigators struggled to find anyone with a motive, and it was only 4 days later that they got their first lead. A man named Laramie Bakay had seen the case featured on America's Most Wanted and contacted the police to report that they should question his neighbor, 43-year-old Harold Martin Smith. 5 days later, they traveled to Smith's house, but when they arrived, he was deceased. The weapon he used to do this was analyzed and found to be a possible match for the weapon used to end Ronnie's life. It was believed at the time that Chasen had attempted to rob Ronni, but that the robbery went awry, and after firing at her, he made his getaway on a bicycle. But not everyone was convinced. Though Smith's weapon was found to be a possible match, it was by no means a certainty that it was the weapon used against Ronni, and those who knew him could see no reason for him to be riding a bicycle at that time of night. No witnesses came forward to report that they'd seen him at the scene, and investigators struggled to find a motive, other than the fact that he was struggling financially. He and Bakay, his neighbor who had turned him in, often shared food stamps, but it seemed unlikely that Smith was the culprit. This led to much speculation, including suggestions that Smith was paid by someone to carry out a hit on Ronni, but no evidence was ever found to support this theory. Bakay stated that he grew suspicious when Smith entered his apartment that night, asking if Ronnie's case had been reported on the news. He then stated that he'd left his bicycle in Beverly Hills, more than 16 miles away, and that he needed to collect it. When he saw the report on television, Bakay remembered that Smith had acted strangely that night and informed the police that he'd been in that area on the night of the incident. The case was promptly closed, and Beverly Hills police revealed that Smith was thought to be the attacker and that the case had been closed, but many people felt this was a little too convenient. Ronnie's Prada handbag was still in the car with her, which would almost certainly have been taken if a robbery had been committed. Furthermore, Smith was never captured by any security cameras in the area, of which there were many. Many questions remain in Ronnie's case, but the police consider the matter closed and have no intentions of revisiting the case in the future. Number 1. John Simon Ritchie is better known by his stage name of Sid Vicious, which he used while playing bass in the English punk band the Sex Pistols. He spent his time moving from place to place with his mother, who was addicted to illegal substances, but in the 1970s he found somewhere that he belonged in the London punk scene. He became the drummer for Susie and the Banshees, as well as Flowers of Romance, and before long was well known in the area. In 1977, he was hired as the bass player for the Sex Pistols, replacing Glenn Matlock, and shortly after met Nancy Spungen, who originally hailed from Philadelphia. Nancy had a much easier upbringing, as she was part of a much more normal family, but had also spent time in a mental facility and a school for troubled children, from where she ran away to New York when she was 17. She became active in the New York punk scene and eventually relocated to London, where she became a groupie. But she wasn't well liked by her fellow groupies, who described her as an obnoxious loudmouth, but she was tolerated by the bands that she followed, since she had a knack for finding illegal substances. According to those in the know, she first tried to get together with the Sex Pistols frontman Johnny Rotten, but when she was rejected, she started focusing on Sid Vicious. The pair quickly fell in love in what many have described as a road to disaster. They found an apartment in London where they moved in together, and soon their use of illegal substances started to get out of hand. The police would knock on their door occasionally, but the couple always managed to evade arrest by one means or another. But the rest of the band members weren't as fond of Nancy as Sid was, and on one occasion their manager, Malcolm McLaren, went as far as attempting to abduct her so that she could be sent back to the US, but Sid intervened and the plan fell through. But she was not allowed to attend any of their shows during their US tours, and this caused Sid to act out even more. During one performance in Dallas, he assaulted a member of the audience with his bass, and by the end of the tour the band had decided to call it quits. Sid took this hard, and coupled with the fact that Nancy wasn't around, he went off the rails, ending up in a Queens hospital after using illegal substances. The couple reunited, but the relationship started to spiral out of control. On the 12th of October, 1978, she was found deceased by a porter in room number 100 of Manhattan's Chelsea Hotel. It was determined that she'd been attacked with a sharpened blade, and the porter reported that Sid was walking around the hallway, stating that he was the one who was responsible. He later told investigators that he was indeed guilty, but later recanted his confession, stating that he was very inebriated that night and had no memory of what had happened. Nonetheless, he was arrested, but released on $50,000 bail shortly after. Less than 4 months later, he passed away due to illegal substance use, leaving the case unsolved, and while many of those who knew Sid maintain his innocence, the truth may never be known. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.